I was about to sign divorce papers for my cheating husband when his mistress husband suddenly showed up, threw $74 million at me, and said, "Do not divorce him yet. Wait 3 more months." True story. What happened next completely destroyed my toxic husband and left his gold digger mistress completely penniless on the streets of New York. My name is Audrey, and at 34 years old, I never expected my marriage to end with my suitcase being thrown into a cold hallway. The heavy thud of my luggage hitting the hardwood floor echoed through the luxury apartment. I stood there staring at my clothes spilling out onto the pristine rug. Nolan, my husband of 6 years, and the chief operating officer of a booming tech startup stood in the doorway with a smirk that made my blood run cold. He tossed a thick stack of legal documents onto the kitchen island. "The apartment is in my name, Audrey," he said coldly. "I bought it before we got married. The divorce papers are right there. Sign them and get out. Sienna is on her way here, and I do not want her to see your depressing face when she arrives." I looked at the man I had supported through his grueling early career. Now that his company was preparing to go public, he had decided I was no longer an adequate accessory. Sienna was a lifestyle influencer married to a Wall Street billionaire, and Nolan thought she was his ticket to the absolute elite circle. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your worth. I walked slowly toward the kitchen island. Sitting on the velvet bar stool was my mother-in-law, Beverly. She was casually sipping an expensive espresso, completely unbothered by the fact that her son was throwing his wife out into the streets. She adjusted her designer silk scarf and let out a soft, condescending laugh. "Let us be honest, Audrey," she said without making eye contact. "You should be grateful you even got to live in a place like this for 6 years. You were always just a stepping stone for my son. An auditor with student loans. Really? Did you actually think you could fit into our family long-term? You belong in the suburbs clipping coupons, not hosting galas in Manhattan. Just sign the papers and go back to wherever middle-class people go when they fail." Her words were designed to break me. Growing up in a modest neighborhood in Ohio, I had worked 3 jobs to pay for my accounting and finance degrees. I knew the value of $1 because I had to bleed for every single one of them. When I met Nolan, he was just an ambitious guy with a flawed business plan. I spent countless nights fixing his financial models and securing the early investments that kept his startup afloat. I was the architect of the foundation he was currently standing on. But to Beverly, I was just a peasant who had overstayed her welcome. I picked up the pen. The cold metal felt heavy in my hand. Part of me just wanted to sign the papers and escape this toxic environment. I had my own successful career as a financial auditor, and I did not need his money to survive. But signing meant letting him take all the credit for the wealth we built together. It meant letting him and Sienna parade around the city pretending they were some kind of power couple while I walked away with nothing but the clothes in my suitcase. I looked at the itemized breakdown of assets attached to the divorce papers. As an auditor, my brain automatically processed the numbers. He was hiding assets. The offshore accounts and the shell corporations he used to fund his lavish lifestyle with Sienna were conveniently missing from the documents. I knew about all of them, but I had stayed quiet out of loyalty. Now he was using that loyalty against me. Nolan tapped his expensive watch impatiently. "Come on, Audrey. I have a dinner reservation at Le Bernardin in an hour. Stop stalling. You know you cannot afford to fight me in court. My lawyers will bury you in legal fees before you even get a hearing. Just take the $10,000 settlement I offered and leave gracefully. $10,000. After 6 years of marriage and building his empire from the ground up, he was offering me the equivalent of what he spent on a weekend getaway with his mistress. My hand trembled slightly, not out of sadness, but out of pure, unadulterated rage. I pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line on the divorce decree. Beverly leaned forward, a victorious smile spreading across her heavily Botoxed face. But right as the ink touched the paper, the heavy oak front door of the apartment swung open. The security system chimed, but neither Nolan nor Beverly moved. We all froze. Standing in the doorway was a man I had only seen in Forbes magazine profiles and financial news segments. It was Harrison, Sienna's husband. The ruthless hedge fund manager known for destroying corporate empires before breakfast. He stepped into the apartment wearing a tailored charcoal suit, carrying a sleek titanium briefcase. He did not look angry. He looked entirely calculated, and he was looking directly at me. Before anyone could say a word, Harrison walked right past my soon-to-be ex-husband, as if he were nothing more than a piece of furniture. His expensive leather shoes clicked against the hardwood floor, echoing in the sudden silence of the apartment. He stopped right at the kitchen island, where the divorce papers lay, waiting for my signature. Nolan finally snapped out of his shock. "Hey, buddy, you cannot just walk in here. Who the hell do you think you are? This is a private residence and we are in the middle of a legal discussion. Get out before I call the front desk and have security drag you out." Harrison did not even turn to look at him. He kept his piercing gaze locked entirely on me. He placed the sleek titanium briefcase onto the marble counter right on top of Nolan's ridiculous settlement offer. The metallic clink sounded like a gavel dropping in a silent courtroom. "My name is Harrison," he said in a voice so calm and authoritative that it commanded absolute attention. "And you must be Audrey, the brilliant financial auditor who built the foundation for this pathetic excuse of a tech company." Beverly stood up from her velvet bar stool, her face flushed with sudden indignation. "Excuse me, how dare you speak about my son company that way? Do you have any idea who he is? He's about to take his startup public. You are trespassing and you need to leave before we press charges." Harrison finally shifted his cold gaze to Beverly. It was a look of pure, unadulterated pity, a look reserved for someone incredibly foolish. "I know exactly who your son is, madam. He is a mediocre manager who is currently sleeping with my wife, Sienna. And judging by the cheap champagne chilling in your refrigerator, he is under the delusion that he has already won." Nolan's face drained of all color. The arrogant smirk he had worn just 5 minutes ago completely vanished, replaced by genuine terror. He took a clumsy step back, bumping into the hallway console table. "You are Sienna's husband," he stammered, his voice suddenly an octave higher and trembling. "Listen, man, I do not know what she told you, but we can talk about this man to man. We do not need to do anything crazy." Harrison ignored Nolan's pathetic attempt to negotiate. He popped the heavy latches on the titanium briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed through the large room. He flipped the lid open and turned it toward me. Inside were neat stacks of certified bank documents, legal trust deeds, and bearer bonds. "Audrey, I am a man who values absolute efficiency," Harrison said, leaning forward slightly. "My wife thinks she is going to divorce me, take half of my assets, and use them to fund your husband's fragile little startup. Your husband thinks he can throw you out with $10,000 and upgrade his life on my dime. They are both terribly mistaken." I stared at the thick documents inside the briefcase. My trained auditor eyes immediately caught the bold numbers printed on the top sheet. $74 million. It was an irrevocable trust, and it was fully liquid. "Do not sign those divorce papers, Audrey," Harrison instructed, his voice dropping to a low, intense register. "If you sign them now, he gets a clean break before his company goes public. He gets to hide the assets he stole. He gets to walk away clean while you start over from nothing. I need you to stay legally married to him for exactly 3 more months." I looked from the $74 million up to Harrison, calculating eyes. "Why 3 months?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly steady, despite the adrenaline rushing through my veins. "Because," Harrison replied, closing the briefcase with a solid snap. "That is exactly how much time I need to legally freeze every single account Sienna has access to. And it is exactly how much time you need to use this capital to buy out the controlling shares of his precious startup before the IPO. We are not just going to divorce them, Audrey. We are going to completely dismantle them." Nolan suddenly lunged forward, trying to grab the briefcase. "Are you insane? You cannot do that. That is illegal market manipulation. I will call the police. I will call the SEC." Harrison turned to Nolan, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Call them?" Harrison challenged, his voice dangerously soft. "Call the Securities and Exchange Commission, Nolan. Ask them to look into the $5 million of investor capital you embezzled to buy my wife a diamond necklace and a sports car. Let us see who goes to federal prison first. Nolan froze, his hand hovering inches from the briefcase. He looked like he was going to be physically sick. Beverly dropped her espresso cup. It shattered on the floor, sending dark liquid pooling across the expensive rug. My son would never do such a thing, Beverly gasped, clutching her pearl necklace. You are lying. You are just a jealous old man trying to ruin a successful young executive. Harrison did not even acknowledge her desperate denial. He looked back at me, waiting for my response. I have read your financial audits, Audrey. You are brilliant, but you are playing too nice. These people do not respect loyalty. They only respect power. I am handing you the power. Do we have a deal? I looked at Nolan, sweating and trembling in the corner of his own apartment. I looked at Beverly, whose entire false reality was crumbling before her very eyes. Then I looked at the plastic pen resting on top of the divorce papers. I picked the pen up and calmly snapped it in half, throwing the pieces onto the floor. We have a deal, Harrison, I said. Harrison smiled for the first time, a cold, terrifying smile. He pulled a fresh contract from his jacket pocket and slid it across the island. Then let the games begin. Harrison did not sit down. He stood tall in the center of the kitchen and pointed to the stack of documents he had just revealed inside his titanium briefcase. His presence was completely suffocating, and neither Nolan nor Beverly dared to interrupt him. Before I married Sienna, I made her sign an ironclad prenuptial agreement, Harrison explained, his voice smooth but laced with venom. It contains a very specific infidelity clause. If she cheats on me, she walks away with absolutely nothing. 0 alimony, 0 properties, 0 investments. She gets the clothes on her back and a one-way ticket out of my penthouse. But Sienna is cunning. She has been quietly funneling my money into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands for the past 14 months, preparing for this exact moment. I listened closely as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked together in my mind. Nolan was not just cheating on me. He was conspiring with Sienna to build a new empire using stolen funds while tossing me aside with a pathetic $10,000 settlement. She thinks she has outsmarted me, Harrison continued. She plans to use that stolen money to fund your husband company right before it goes public, guaranteeing herself a massive payout that I cannot touch. I need exactly 90 days to trace those international shell companies and legally freeze her offshore accounts. If you divorce Nolan today, he becomes a free man. He and Sienna will merge their stolen assets, and the moment his tech startup launches its initial public offering, they will both become untouchable billionaires. Harrison leaned closer to me, locking his cold eyes with mine. But if you refuse to sign those divorce papers, you remain his legal spouse. You maintain your legal right to audit his company. You keep your access to his internal financial records. You become my inside man, Audrey. You track the dirty money from the inside while I lock down the trap from the outside. Nolan's face was turning a dangerous shade of red. The veins in his neck were bulging. This is extortion, he yelled, slamming his fist onto the marble counter. You cannot come into my home and plot against me. I will have my corporate lawyers draft a restraining order immediately. I will force the divorce through the courts, whether she signs it or not. Harrison calmly buttoned his suit jacket, completely unfazed by the outburst. Force it through the courts then, Nolan. But the moment you file contested divorce proceedings, your company financial records become public domain. Every single venture capitalist and investor will see the $5 million you embezzled. Your initial public offering will collapse overnight, and you will be facing federal fraud charges before the end of the month. Go ahead. Make the call. Nolan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was completely trapped, and he knew it. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the walls were closing in. I looked down at the torn divorce papers resting on the kitchen island. My heart was pounding, but my mind was crystal clear. As an auditor, I lived for uncovering financial discrepancies. Now I was going to audit my own husband and tear his life apart number by number. I gathered the torn pages, carefully lined up the edges, and folded them perfectly in half. I slid them back across the marble counter toward Nolan. I am not going anywhere, Nolan, I said, my voice steady and terrifyingly cold. I am your legal wife. Half of this apartment is mine. Half of your shares are mine. And until a federal judge tells me otherwise, I am staying right here." Beverly gasped loudly, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. "You cannot be serious, Audrey. You are going to stay under the same roof as a man who explicitly does not want you. Have you absolutely no pride? You are acting like a desperate gold digger trying to steal my son's hard-earned wealth." "Pride does not pay the bills, Beverly," I replied without breaking eye contact with my mother-in-law. "But a massive corporate buyout certainly will. I suggest you get comfortable because the next 3 months are going to be very educational for all of us." Harrison picked up his briefcase and snapped it shut. He gave me a brief, respectful nod. "I will be in touch, Audrey. Keep your eyes open and do what you do best. Follow the money." He turned and walked out the front door, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in his wake. The moment the heavy door clicked shut, Nolan completely lost his mind. He swept his arm across the kitchen island, sending the expensive fruit bowl and the espresso machine crashing onto the hardwood floor. Shards of ceramic and coffee grounds exploded everywhere. He screamed, kicking the wooden cabinets like a spoiled toddler throwing a massive tantrum. "You ruined everything," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are an absolute psychopath. I am bringing Sienna here tonight, and there is nothing you can do to stop me. I will make your life a living hell until you beg me to let you leave." I looked at the broken porcelain and spilled coffee on the floor. I did not feel scared. I did not feel heartbroken. I felt a calculating energy taking over my entire body. "Bring her," I said softly, stepping over the mess. "Bring your little fake influencer right here, Nolan. Let us see exactly how much she loves you when she finds out you are both about to lose absolutely everything." I carried the heavy black trash bag toward the side of the house, where the large disposal bins were kept. The noise of the barbecue faded behind me. As I rounded the corner near the garage, I stopped dead in my tracks. 2 men were standing in the shade of the large oak tree, engaged in a heated, whispered argument. It was Nolan and his brother-in-law, Dion. Dion is married to Nolan's older sister, Gemma. He is a brilliant 36-year-old African-American corporate lawyer who usually stays out of family drama. But today he looked incredibly tense, his arms crossed over his chest as he glared down at my husband. I pressed my back against the brick wall of the house, perfectly hidden from their view, but close enough to hear every single word. "I am not telling you this as your brother-in-law, Nolan Dion," said his voice low and firm. "I am telling you this as a corporate attorney who knows how the Securities and Exchange Commission operates. You are playing a very dangerous game. I saw the preliminary financial disclosures your accounting team prepared for the upcoming initial public offering. There are massive gaping holes in your operational budget." Nolan scoffed loudly, kicking a pebble on the driveway. "Relax, Dion," he replied, his tone dripping with his usual arrogance. "It is standard startup procedure. We are scaling rapidly. There are bound to be some overlapping expenses. My financial team knows exactly how to categorize things to keep the board happy. Besides, once we go public next month, the influx of capital will wash out any minor discrepancies. You worry too much." "Overlapping expenses," Dion repeated incredulously. "Nolan, you categorized a 2-week luxury villa rental in Bora Bora as a corporate team-building retreat. You did not take your executive team. You took Sienna. I know it, and anyone with half a brain looking at those receipts will know it too. You are actively commingling investor capital with your personal expenses. That is not a minor discrepancy. That is textbook embezzlement. If the feds audit your books before the IPO launches, they will not just halt the offering, they will put you in federal prison." My auditor brain immediately kicked into high gear. Everything Harrison had told me in my apartment was completely accurate. Nolan was not just cheating on me. He was actively stealing millions of dollars from his own company to fund his luxurious new life with his mistress. As a certified financial auditor, I knew exactly how fragile those accounting tricks were. All it took was one person pulling the right thread, and the entire sweater would unravel. I just needed to find the thread. Nolan laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "You are just jealous, Dion. You sit in your boring law firm drafting contracts all day, while I am out here building a billion-dollar tech empire. Just mind your own business and let me handle my company. Sienna is my future, and I am going to make sure she lives like a queen. Once the divorce with Audrey is finalized and the IPO hits, I will be untouchable. Dion shook his head, looking at Nolan with a mixture of disgust and pity. You are a fool, Nolan, Dion said quietly. You are burning down a solid foundation to build a house of cards. Do not call me to represent you when the feds show up at your door. With that, Dion turned and started walking back toward the backyard. I quickly stepped out from behind the wall, pretending to just arrive with the trash bag. Dion paused when he saw me. His eyes darted to the trash bag in my hand and then to my face. He knew my mother-in-law had sent me out here like the help. For a brief second, a look of genuine sympathy crossed his face. Audrey, he said softly, nodding his head in acknowledgement. Dion, I replied, giving him a polite smile. I walked past him and threw the heavy bag into the dumpster with a loud, satisfying thud. Nolan walked out from the shade, adjusting his expensive polo shirt. He glared at me. What are you doing lurking around here? He snapped. I dusted my hands off and looked him dead in the eye. Just taking out the trash, Nolan, I said smoothly. Beverly asked me to clean up your mess. It seems like cleaning up your messes is all I ever do lately. But do not worry. I have a feeling I am almost done. He rolled his eyes, completely missing the double meaning of my words. Just go back to the basement when you are finished, he muttered, before walking away to rejoin Sienna. I stood there alone by the driveway, my mind racing with formulas and access codes. Since we were technically still married and I was originally listed as a founding shareholder, I still had legal login credentials to the company internal financial portal. Harrison needed 3 months to freeze Sienna offshore accounts, but I needed less than 3 hours to tear into Nolan corporate ledgers. I realized that the $74 million Harrison had placed in my trust was not just a safety net. It was a weapon, and I was ready to use it. The hunt for the missing $5 million had officially begun. I carried the heavy black trash bag toward the side of the house where the large disposal bins were kept. The noise of the barbecue faded behind me. As I rounded the corner near the garage, I stopped dead in my tracks. 2 men were standing in the shade of the large oak tree, engaged in a heated, whispered argument. It was Nolan and his brother-in-law, Dion. Dion is a brilliant 36-year-old African-American corporate lawyer who usually stays out of family drama. He is married to Nolan's older sister, Gemma, but today he looked incredibly tense, his arms crossed over his chest as he glared down at my husband. I pressed my back against the brick wall of the house, perfectly hidden from their view, but close enough to hear every single word. I am not telling you this as your brother-in-law, Nolan, Dion said, his voice low and firm. I am telling you this as a corporate attorney who knows exactly how the Securities and Exchange Commission operates. You are playing a very dangerous game. I saw the preliminary financial disclosures your accounting team prepared for the upcoming initial public offering. There are massive gaping holes in your operational budget. Nolan scoffed loudly, kicking a pebble on the driveway. Relax, Dion, he replied, his tone dripping with his usual arrogance. It is standard startup procedure. We are scaling rapidly. There are bound to be some overlapping expenses. My financial team knows exactly how to categorize things to keep the board happy. Besides, once we go public next month, the influx of capital will wash out any minor discrepancies. You worry too much. Overlapping expenses, Dion repeated incredulously. Nolan, you categorized a 2-week luxury villa rental in Bora Bora as a corporate team building retreat. You did not take your executive team. You took Sienna. I know it, and anyone with half a brain looking at those receipts will know it too. You are actively commingling investor capital with your personal expenses. That is not a minor discrepancy. That is textbook embezzlement. Dion stepped closer to Nolan, his voice dropping even lower but gaining a sharp edge. It is not just the Bora Bora trip. I saw the expense reports for the private jet charters to Aspen. I saw the invoices for the diamond tennis bracelet that you somehow logged as a corporate client gifting expense. You are treating your investors' money like a personal piggy bank to impress a woman who is already married to a billionaire. Do you have any idea how reckless that is? The federal regulators use automated algorithms to flag these exact types of anomalies. Nolan crossed his arms, looking completely unbothered. Let them flag it. My lead accountant used a vendor masking technique. The money looks like it went to a third-party logistics consulting firm. It is clean, Dion. You lawyers always panic over nothing. We secure the new funding round next week, we go public next month, and the valuation will skyrocket so high that no one will care about a few $1 million in operational overhead. Dayon let out a heavy sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Vendor masking is just a fancy term for wire fraud, Nolan. If you get caught, the board of directors will throw you to the wolves to save the company. They will fire you, strip your equity, and hand you over to the authorities. I am warning you because Gemma loves you, and she would be devastated to see her brother in federal prison. But I will not risk my law license to cover up your mess. My heart pounded against my ribs, but my breathing remained perfectly controlled. Vendor masking. He had just handed me the exact blueprint of his crime. As an auditor, I specialized in tracing masked transactions through international banking systems. I knew exactly how to penetrate the layers of fake invoices and shell vendors. Nolan thought he was a genius for hiding personal expenses under logistics consulting, but he had forgotten that his wife was the one who originally designed the financial architecture of his startup. I knew every backdoor, every password protocol, and every hidden ledger in that system. Dayon shook his head, looking at Nolan with a mixture of disgust and pity. "You are a fool, Nolan," Dayon said quietly. "You are burning down a solid foundation to build a house of cards. Do not call me to represent you when the feds show up at your door." With that, Dayon turned and started walking back toward the backyard. I quickly stepped out from behind the wall, pretending to just arrive with the trash bag. Dayon paused when he saw me. His eyes darted to the trash bag in my hand, and then to my face. He knew my mother-in-law had sent me out here like the help. For a brief second, a look of genuine sympathy crossed his face. "Audrey," he said softly, nodding his head in acknowledgement. "Dayon," I replied, giving him a polite smile. I walked past him and threw the heavy bag into the dumpster with a loud, satisfying thud. Nolan walked out from the shade, adjusting his expensive polo shirt. He glared at me. "What are you doing lurking around here?" he snapped. I dusted my hands off and looked him dead in the eye. "Just taking out the trash, Nolan," I said smoothly. "Beverly asked me to clean up your mess. It seems like cleaning up your messes is all I ever do lately, but do not worry. Do not. I have a feeling I'm almost done." He rolled his eyes, completely missing the double meaning of my words. "Just stay out of my way," he muttered before walking away to rejoin Sienna. I stood there alone by the driveway, my mind racing with formulas and access codes. Since we were technically still married, and I was originally listed as a founding shareholder, I still had legal login credentials to the company internal financial portal. Harrison needed 3 months to freeze Sienna offshore accounts, but I needed less than 3 hours to tear into Nolan corporate ledgers. I realized that the $74 million Harrison had placed in my trust was not just a safety net. It was a weapon, and I was ready to use it. The hunt for the missing $5 million had officially begun. I walked back into the house just as the backyard barbecue was finally winding down. The air inside the luxury apartment felt thick and suffocating. Sienna was lounging on the expensive suede sofa in the living room, holding a glass of wine and whining loudly to Nolan. When she saw me walk in, she let out an exaggerated sigh and slammed her wine glass onto the glass coffee table. "Nolan, I really cannot stand this for another second," Sienna complained, her voice high-pitched and grating. "Your mother just told me that she keeps hovering around on purpose to embarrass me in front of our guests. Every time I see her gloomy face in this house, I feel incredibly stressed. I cannot even walk freely in what is supposed to be my future home. I feel like an unwanted guest being watched by a stalker." Beverly, who was standing nearby, immediately nodded in agreement. "Sienna is absolutely right," son Beverly added. "Why are you letting a freeloader continue to take up our living space? If she insists on being shameless and refusing to leave until the divorce is finalized by the court, then you need to at least get her out of our sight. You cannot let the woman you love suffer in your own home like this." Nolan quickly rubbed Sienna back, comforting her with the most sickeningly sweet tone he could muster. "Do not worry, baby," Nolan said. "I will handle this right now. I will not let anyone upset you anymore." He turned around and marched toward me. He crossed his arms over his chest, glaring at me with absolute contempt. "Listen to me, Audrey," he ordered coldly. Your presence on the main floors is disturbing Sienna and my mother. Since you insist on clinging to this house like a leech, you are going to have to move your things down to the basement. Immediately. You are no longer permitted to use the master bedroom or the living room. The basement is the only place for you now. I looked around the luxurious open-concept kitchen and then glanced down at the floor. The basement of this property was an unfinished damp space primarily used for storing old furniture and cardboard boxes. It had no windows and no natural sunlight. A normal woman would have felt utterly humiliated being forced by her husband to surrender her master bedroom to his mistress and crawl into a dark cellar. But I was not a normal woman. In reality, being banished to the basement was the greatest gift they could have possibly handed me in that moment. I needed a completely private space away from prying eyes to infiltrate the financial systems of his company. Down in the basement, no one would bother me. No one would be able to peek over my shoulder at my computer screen. I looked up at Nolan and offered a faint, submissive smile. "Okay, Nolan," I replied in a perfectly calm and even tone. "If that is what you and Sienna want, I will pack my things and move down to the basement right now. I certainly do not want to ruin anyone's mood." Both Nolan and Sienna looked genuinely shocked by my sudden obedience. They exchanged a smug look, clearly believing that they had finally broken my spirit and forced me to accept my pathetic fate. Beverly scoffed and walked past me. "What a useless coward," Beverly muttered loudly. "She does not even have the spine to fight back." I ignored their childish insults. I walked straight up the stairs to the master bedroom and grabbed my clothes, my toiletries, and most importantly, my high-powered laptop and my military-grade encrypted hard drives. As I carried my heavy duffel bag down the creaky wooden stairs into the basement, the cold, damp air immediately surrounded me. I pulled the string to turn on the single dim overhead bulb. The space was cramped and smelled like dust and mildew. But to me, this was my new command center. I dragged an old wooden desk into the corner of the room, wiped away the cobwebs, and set up my laptop. I plugged in the power cord and booted up the system. The screen glowed brightly, reflecting in my eyes. My heart began to beat faster with every keystroke. Because I was still legally his wife, and still listed as an original founding shareholder, I retained top-tier administrative access to the internal network. Nolan was so arrogant and stupid that he completely forgot to revoke my security clearance. They were just a bunch of vain fools who cared about appearances while leaving the back door to their entire fortress wide open. I sat there in the dark basement, smiling brighter than I had in years. They thought they had buried me under a pile of garbage, but they had no idea they just handed me the shovel I needed to dig their graves. The glow of the laptop screen was the only source of light in the damp basement. I sat in the suffocating silence, listening to the faint footsteps of my husband and his mistress walking across the hardwood floors right above my head. They were probably pouring another glass of expensive wine, laughing about how easily they had pushed me aside. But down here in the dark, I was not the victim anymore. I was the executioner. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Because I had designed the original financial architecture of the company, I knew exactly where the blind spots were. Nolan, lead accountant, was a fresh college graduate who only knew how to follow basic instructions. He was no match for a seasoned auditor. I bypassed the standard employee dashboard and accessed the master general ledger. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the exact vendor masking protocol Dion had mentioned in the driveway. I opened a file labeled Third-Party Logistics and Consulting. To an untrained eye or a lazy investor, it looked like standard operational overhead. But as I cross-referenced the employer identification numbers, I quickly noticed a pattern. The payments were being wired to a series of limited liability companies registered in Delaware. I ran those company names through a public registry database. All of them had been created within the last 14 months, right around the time Nolan first met Sienna. I started pulling the individual invoices and matching them against Sienna public social media posts. It was almost too easy. It was actually pathetic how sloppy they were. On April 12th, the company ledger showed a $250,000 wire transfer for an executive team building retreat. On April 14th, Sienna posted a picture on Instagram from a private overwater bungalow in Bora Bora. On July 3rd, there was an $80,000 expense logged as client retention gifts. On July 5th, Sienna uploaded a video showing off a custom diamond tennis bracelet. The audacity was sickening, but it made my job incredibly simple. They were leaving a digital paper trail as wide as a highway. I kept scrolling through the vendor payments. I found a wire transfer for $120,000 classified as an emergency server hardware upgrade. A quick search of the routing number revealed it went straight to a luxury exotic car dealership in Miami. Sienna had posted a photo posing on the hood of a brand new red sports car that same week with a caption thanking her generous king. But I knew those were just the small expenses. Dion had warned that the hole in the budget was massive. I dug deeper into the Series B funding capital. This was the money venture capitalists had given Nolan to scale the software platform. Instead of hiring developers, he had created a phantom payroll system. Line by line, row by row, I followed the digital breadcrumbs. I traced the money flowing from the company operating account through 2 different offshore accounts before finally landing in a private wealth management fund. The total amount stolen from the investors was staggering, exactly $5,200,000 to be precise. Nolan had systematically bled his own company dry. He had completely drained the cash reserves of the startup right before the initial public offering. He was banking his entire survival on the stock market launch succeeding. If the public offering failed or was delayed by even a single month, the company would bounce its payroll checks and immediately file for bankruptcy. I leaned back in the creaky wooden chair and let out a long breath. The sheer magnitude of his arrogance was breathtaking. He actually believed that the influx of cash from the upcoming stock market launch would magically cover up this massive financial crater. But he did not understand how the Securities and Exchange Commission operated. The moment he filed the public offering paperwork, federal algorithms would scan these exact ledgers. If a normal auditor found this, it would be a red flag. But with me finding it, it was an absolute death sentence. I plugged my military-grade encrypted flash drive into the laptop port. I began downloading every single invoice, every fake wire transfer receipt, and every manipulated tax form. I organized the files into a clean, undeniable portfolio of corporate fraud. I built the exact case a federal prosecutor would need to bypass a preliminary investigation and go straight for an indictment. Nolan thought our biggest conflict was going to be a messy divorce over a shared apartment and a few credit cards. He thought offering me a $10,000 settlement was a clever negotiation tactic. He had absolutely no idea that I was currently holding a digital bomb that would destroy his entire existence. This was no longer a civil family court matter. Embezzling $5 million from venture capitalists and falsifying corporate tax returns before a public offering were severe federal crimes. We were talking about wire fraud, money laundering, and securities fraud. If this information reached the authorities, Nolan would not just lose his precious company and his gold digger mistress. He would be facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I watched the download progress bar slowly crawl to 99 and then hit 100%. A soft chime echoed in the damp basement, signaling that the transfer was complete. I safely ejected the flash drive and held the cool metal in the palm of my hand. I squeezed it tightly, feeling the sharp edges press into my skin. Nolan and Beverly wanted me in the basement because they thought I belonged in the dirt. But from down here in the dark, I had just uprooted the entire foundation of their lives. The trap was fully loaded. Now I just needed the company to make its next move. The next morning, I left the apartment before the sun even came up. Nolan and Sienna were still fast asleep in the master bedroom upstairs, completely unaware that their entire world was already collapsing. I walked several blocks through the brisk morning air to ensure no one was watching before I hailed a taxi. I gave the driver a specific address in the heart of the Manhattan financial district. My destination was an ultra-exclusive private club where billionaires quietly orchestrated massive corporate takeovers behind heavy mahogany doors. When I arrived, a discreet waiter in a perfectly tailored black suit guided me down a long, silent corridor. He opened the door to a private conference room. Harrison was already there, sitting at the head of a massive black marble table. He was flanked by 3 middle-aged men in expensive custom suits, holding thick leather briefcases. They radiated a terrifying level of cold professionalism. Harrison looked up and gestured for me to take the empty leather chair immediately to his right. He introduced the three men briefly. They were his elite offshore legal team, the absolute best in the financial world, at building and concealing complex corporate structures. I reached into my bag and pulled out the military-grade encrypted flash drive containing all the evidence I had gathered in the basement. I placed it on the cold black marble and pushed it toward Harrison. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered my report. $5,200,000, I said, my voice steady and calculated. Nolan has embezzled exactly that amount. He used the venture capital funds to buy luxury sports cars, diamond jewelry, and exotic vacations for Sienna. All of it is clumsily disguised as logistics and consulting expenses on the main ledger. The digital paper trail is fully documented on that drive. If we hand this over to the Securities and Exchange Commission today, he will be facing federal prison by the end of the week. A slow, calculating smile spread across Harrison's face. He looked at his lawyers and nodded with quiet satisfaction. "We have the rope," Harrison said quietly. "Now it is time to expertly build the gallows." He turned his attention back to me. He explained that simply sending Nolan to prison was not enough punishment for what he and Sienna were trying to pull. To truly destroy him, we had to strip him of his greatest source of pride. We had to take his company right out from under him just days before his precious initial public offering. We were going to use his own bottomless greed and sheer desperation to execute him. Using the $74 million trust fund Harrison had provided, we initiated the process of creating a massive shell company. The legal team immediately began drafting the complex paperwork to establish a corporate entity in the Cayman Islands. It was a well-known tax haven with absolute corporate secrecy laws that would completely shield my identity from any public registry. We named the entity Apex Global Ventures. It sounded like a prestigious international investment firm, but it was nothing more than a ghost. It had no actual employees and no physical office space. It was just a hollow shell armed with an astronomical amount of liquid cash, ready to swallow its prey whole. Harrison laid out the trap meticulously. Apex Global Ventures would approach Nolan Tech Startup as a mysterious but highly aggressive institutional investor. We would offer an irresistible lifeline, a sudden injection of $50 million in pure cash right before the public offering in exchange for a majority controlling stake in the company. Nolan is currently suffocating under the weight of that $5 million missing hole, I realized aloud, piecing the psychological trap together. If the independent auditors catch it during the final public offering review, he loses absolutely everything. He is desperate for a massive influx of cash to wash the books clean and cover his tracks. "Exactly," Harrison replied, leaning back in his leather chair. "When he sees $50 million on the table, he will be completely blinded by his own arrogance and relief. He will genuinely think he is a financial genius being aggressively courted by Wall Street elite. He will be so eager to save his own skin and secure his billionaire status that he will not bother to closely read the fine print. He will blindly sign away the controlling rights to his entire empire directly to you." One of the elite lawyers slid a thick stack of incorporation documents across the marble table. He handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. I needed to officially sign on as the hidden chief executive officer and sole beneficiary of Apex Global Ventures. I took the pen and carefully wrote my signature on the dotted line. Each stroke of the pen felt like I was slowly carving the irreversible death sentence for my husband's career. When the paperwork was finalized, Harrison stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. He told me to go back to that damp basement and continue playing the role of the defeated, pathetic wife. He wanted me to let Nolan and Sienna fly as high as possible on their delusions of grandeur. The higher they flew, the more devastating the impact would be when they finally hit the concrete. I shook his hand and walked out of the private club. The morning air in New York felt incredibly crisp and refreshing. The game board was perfectly set. The ultimate legal trap was armed and waiting in the shadows. Now all I had to do was sit quietly in the dark basement and watch my arrogant husband willingly walk right into his own execution. A few days after my meeting with Harrison, I knew I needed to keep my toxic in-laws distracted. I needed them to focus on petty domestic dramas so they would not notice the massive corporate guillotine swinging toward their necks. So I decided to set a very small but very obvious trap. I ordered a custom $15,000 evening gown from a high-end designer using my own personal offshore account. When the physical receipt was delivered, I intentionally left it sitting right in the middle of my wooden desk in the basement. I knew my mother-in-law Beverly had zero boundaries and an obsessive need to snoop through my belongings whenever I left the room. Later that afternoon, I walked upstairs to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. Right on cue, I heard a shrill gasp echoing from the basement stairs. Heavy footsteps pounded up the wooden steps. Beverly burst into the kitchen, her face flushed bright red with fake outrage. She was waving the crumpled designer receipt in the air like she had just discovered a murder weapon. "Audrey, you absolute thief!" Beverly screamed at the top of her lungs. She slammed the piece of paper onto the marble kitchen island. Nolan and Sienna, who had been lounging in the living room, immediately rushed in to see the commotion. "What is going on?" Mom Nolan asked, looking annoyed. "Look at this," Beverly spat, pointing a shaking finger at the receipt. "Your pathetic excuse for a wife just bought a $15,000 dress. Where do you think she got that kind of money, Nolan? She is a low-level auditor burdened with student debt. She must have stolen your credit card information. She is draining your bank accounts right under our noses." Nolan's face darkened instantly. He snatched the receipt from the counter and scanned the numbers. His jaw clenched in anger. "Are you out of your mind, Audrey?" he yelled, taking a step toward me. "My startup is in a critical funding phase and you are down in the basement secretly maxing out my credit lines to buy luxury clothes. You are paying me back every single cent. I will have my lawyers add this to your debt in the divorce settlement." I stood leaning against the refrigerator holding my glass of water. I did not flinch. I did not defend myself. I just watched them unravel over $15,000, completely oblivious to the fact that Nolan had already stolen $5 million. Before I could even respond, Sienna pulled out her expensive smartphone and tapped the screen. A bright ring light flashed as she started recording a live video for her thousands of social media followers. She flipped her blonde hair and pointed the camera directly at my face. "Hey guys," Sienna said, putting on her best fake sympathetic voice. "Just wanted to show you what a real gold digger looks like. This is my boyfriend's soon-to-be ex-wife. She refuses to move out of his apartment, and now we just caught her stealing $15,000 to buy a designer dress. Can you imagine being this desperate and pathetic? She is literally living in our basement but trying to pretend she belongs in high society." Sienna shoved the phone closer to my face. "Say hi to my followers, Audrey," she mocked. "Tell them why you think you are entitled to my boyfriend, hard-earned wealth. Tell them where you plan to wear a $15,000 gown. Are you going to a gala for homeless squatters?" Beverly clapped her hands together, laughing loudly at Sienna's cruel joke. "That is exactly what she is," Beverly chimed in loudly so the camera would pick up her voice. "A shameless squatter trying to steal from her betters. You should post that everywhere, Sienna. Let the whole world know what kind of criminal she really is." Nolan smirked, crossing his arms. He looked incredibly proud of his mistress. He thought they had completely humiliated me. He thought he had the upper hand. I took a slow, calm sip of my water. The cold liquid felt refreshing against my throat. I looked directly into the lens of Sienna's camera, and then shifted my gaze to meet her eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not look angry. I looked at her with the absolute coldness of an executioner who had already pulled the lever. "You should be very careful about what you broadcast to the world, Sienna," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "A loud mouth is a massive liability, especially when you have absolutely no idea who actually owns the money you are bragging about. Do not let your mouth ruin what little future you have left." Sienna faltered for a second, her fake smile dropping. My absolute lack of fear unsettled her. She quickly ended the live stream and slipped the phone back into her pocket, looking slightly unnerved. "Are you threatening her?" Nolan barked, stepping in front of Sienna like a protective hero. "You steal from me, and then you threaten my girlfriend in my own house." I set my water glass down on the counter. The sharp clink of the glass echoed in the tense kitchen. "I am not threatening anyone, Nolan," I replied smoothly. "I am just giving financial advice. You all seem very concerned about $15,000 today. You should save that energy. You are going to need it. I turned my back on them and walked calmly toward the basement door. Behind me, I could hear Beverly muttering insults and Nolan trying to comfort Sienna. They thought they had won a massive victory by exposing my expensive receipt. They thought I was retreating in shame. They had absolutely no idea that while they were throwing a tantrum over a dress, the corporate trap I set with Apex Global Ventures was already closing around them. I walked down into the dark basement smiling to myself. The bait had worked perfectly. The very next afternoon, Nolan called an emergency meeting in the main living room of our apartment. He was too impatient to wait for his own company legal team to process the massive $50 million investment offer. Instead, he demanded that his brother-in-law Dion come over immediately to review the preliminary contract. I walked upstairs from the basement and stood quietly in the kitchen pretending to organize the pantry. From my vantage point, I had a perfect view of the living room and could hear every single word being spoken. Dion sat on the edge of the suede sofa wearing a sharp navy suit. He held the thick stack of legal documents in his hands. He did not look excited or impressed. His dark eyes scanned the pages rapidly, and his expression grew more severe with every paragraph he read. Nolan was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor, rubbing his hands together in pure anticipation. Sienna was sitting nearby, filing her nails and looking incredibly bored by the legal jargon. "Well," Dion Nolan asked impatiently, "it is a standard venture capital buyout, right? Tell me it is good to go, so I can sign it, and we can pop another bottle of champagne." Dion slowly lowered the documents and looked up at Nolan. His face was entirely serious. "Nolan, this is not a standard venture capital contract," Dion said, his voice firm and laced with genuine concern. "This is one of the most aggressive and predatory term sheets I have ever seen in my entire career. You cannot sign this." Nolan stopped pacing. The arrogant smile vanished from his face, replaced by a defensive scowl. "What are you talking about?" Nolan snapped. "It is $50 million in pure cash. Apex Global Ventures is valuing my company at a massive premium. They are handing me the keys to the billionaire club. They are handing you a loaded gun," Dion fired back, standing up to meet Nolan eye to eye. "Look at Section 4, the Accelerated Asset Seizure Clause. It explicitly states that if any financial discrepancies or undisclosed liabilities are discovered during the mandatory pre-public offering audit, Apex Global Ventures retains the immediate right to seize your controlling equity. They do not even need a court order, Nolan. They can strip you of your own company overnight." Sienna stopped filing her nails and looked up, clearly confused, but annoyed that someone was ruining the celebratory mood. "It is just legal mumbo-jumbo," she whined. "Every contract has that stuff." "Right, Nolan." "Exactly." Nolan agreed, pointing a finger at Dion. "My financial books are perfectly clean, Dion. My accounting team used elite vendor masking techniques. No one is going to find any discrepancies. You are overreacting because you do not understand how high-level Wall Street acquisitions work." Dion slammed the contract onto the glass coffee table. The loud thud echoed through the apartment. "I understand exactly how federal fraud works, Nolan," Dion said, his voice rising in anger. "You embezzled over $5 million to buy sports cars and diamond necklaces for a woman you are not even married to. You think a ghost company like Apex Global Ventures is just going to hand you $50 million and not audit every single penny in your ledger. If they find the missing money, they will not just take your company. They will hand the evidence straight to the federal authorities. You will lose everything and you will go to federal prison." The air in the living room turned ice cold. For a split second, I saw a flash of genuine fear in Nolan's eyes. But his towering ego and his bottomless greed quickly swallowed his common sense. He could not stand being lectured by his brother-in-law, especially in front of his mistress. "You are just jealous," Nolan spat, taking a threatening step toward Dion. "You have always been jealous of me. You sit in your boring corporate law firm billing by the hour, while I am out here building a tech empire. You cannot stand the fact that I'm about to become a billionaire while you are just a glorified paper pusher. I brought you here to review a contract, not to give me life advice." Dion stared at Nolan for a long, silent moment. The genuine concern in his eyes completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but absolute disgust. He slowly buttoned his suit jacket and shook his head. I am not jealous, Nolan Dion said softly. I am just a lawyer trying to stop a fool from signing his own death warrant. But you have made your choice. Do not call my phone when the federal agents show up at your door. I will not represent you, and I will not let you drag my wife into your criminal mess. Dion turned his back on them and walked straight toward the front door. He caught my eye as he passed the kitchen. I gave him a slow, subtle nod. He nodded back a silent acknowledgement that he had done all he could and that Nolan's fate was now entirely in his own hands. The heavy front door clicked shut behind him. Nolan scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively at the closed door. What a pathetic loser, Nolan muttered. He just does not have the stomach for real business. Nolan sat down at the coffee table and picked up his expensive gold pen. Sienna leaned over his shoulder, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing his cheek. Do it, baby, she whispered. Make us rich. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen watching as Nolan pressed the gold pen to the paper. He signed his name with a bold, arrogant flourish on the bottom line of the contract. He had just legally transferred the absolute power to destroy his life directly into my hands. The bait was swallowed, the hook was set, and the trap was permanently locked. Tôi thành thật xin lỗi, vì sự nhầm lẫn ngớ ngẩn vừa rồi. Tôi đã hiểu rõ yêu cầu. Dưới đây là toàn bộ nội dung, đoạn 11 được viết hoàn toàn bằng tiếng Anh, không có dấu câu đặc biệt để tối ưu cho dòng đọc AI của bạn. The very next afternoon, Nolan called an emergency meeting in the main living room of our apartment. He was too impatient to wait for his own company legal team to process the massive $50 million investment offer. Instead, he demanded that his brother-in-law, Dion, come over immediately to review the preliminary contract. I walked upstairs from the basement and stood quietly in the kitchen, pretending to organize the pantry. From my vantage point, I had a perfect view of the living room and could hear every single word being spoken. Dion sat on the edge of the suede sofa wearing a sharp navy suit. He held the thick stack of legal documents in his hands. He did not look excited or impressed. His dark eyes scanned the pages rapidly, and his expression grew more severe with every paragraph he read. Nolan was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor, rubbing his hands together in pure anticipation. Sienna was sitting nearby, filing her nails and looking incredibly bored by the complicated legal jargon. Well, Dion, Nolan asked impatiently. It is a standard venture capital buyout, right? Tell me it is good to go so I can sign it and we can pop another bottle of champagne. Dion slowly lowered the documents and looked up at Nolan. His face was entirely serious. Nolan, this is not a standard venture capital contract, Dion said, his voice firm and laced with genuine concern. This is one of the most aggressive and predatory term sheets I have ever seen in my entire career. You cannot sign this. Nolan stopped pacing. The arrogant smile vanished from his face, replaced by a defensive scowl. What are you talking about? Nolan snapped. It is $50 million in pure cash. Apex Global Ventures is valuing my company at a massive premium. They are handing me the keys to the billionaire club. They are handing you a loaded gun, Dion fired back, standing up to meet Nolan eye to eye. Look at Section 4. The Accelerated Asset Seizure Clause. It explicitly states that if any financial discrepancies or undisclosed liabilities are discovered during the mandatory pre-public offering audit, Apex Global Ventures retains the immediate right to seize your controlling equity. They do not even need a court order, Nolan. They can strip you of your own company overnight. Sienna stopped filing her nails and looked up, clearly confused but annoyed that someone was ruining the celebratory mood. It is just legal mumbo-jumbo, she whined. Every contract has that stuff. Right, Nolan? Exactly, Nolan agreed, pointing a finger at Dion. My financial books are perfectly clean, Dion. My accounting team used elite vendor masking techniques. No one is going to find any discrepancies. You are overreacting because you do not understand how high-level Wall Street acquisitions work. Dion slammed the contract onto the glass coffee table. The loud thud echoed through the apartment. I understand exactly how federal fraud works, Nolan. Dion said, his voice rising in anger. You embezzled over $5 million to buy sports cars and diamond necklaces for a woman you are not even married to. You think a ghost company like Apex Global Ventures is just going to hand you $50 million and not audit every single penny in your ledger. If they find the missing money, they will not just take your company. They will hand the evidence straight to the federal authorities. You will lose everything and you will go to federal prison. The air in the living room turned ice cold. For a split second, I saw a flash of genuine fear in Nolan's eyes. But his towering ego and his bottomless greed quickly swallowed his common sense. He could not stand being lectured by his brother-in-law, especially in front of his mistress. "You are just jealous," Nolan spat, taking a threatening step toward Dion. "You have always been jealous of me. You sit in your boring corporate law firm billing by the hour while I am out here building a tech empire. You cannot stand the fact that I am about to become a billionaire while you are just a glorified paper pusher. I brought you here to review a contract, not to give me life advice." Dion stared at Nolan for a long, silent moment. The genuine concern in his eyes completely dissolved, leaving behind nothing but absolute disgust. He slowly buttoned his suit jacket and shook his head. "I am not jealous," Dion said softly. "I am just a lawyer trying to stop a fool from signing his own death warrant. But you have made your choice. Do not call my phone when the federal agents show up at your door. I will not represent you, and I will not let you drag my wife into your criminal mess." Dion turned his back on them and walked straight toward the front door. He caught my eye as he passed the kitchen. I gave him a slow, subtle nod. He nodded back, a silent acknowledgement that he had done all he could and that Nolan's fate was now entirely in his own hands. The heavy front door clicked shut behind him. Nolan scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively at the closed door. "What a pathetic loser," Nolan muttered. "He just does not have the stomach for real business." Nolan sat down at the coffee table and picked up his expensive gold pen. Sienna leaned over his shoulder, wrapping her arms around his neck and kissing his cheek. "Do it, baby," she whispered. "Make us rich." I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, watching as Nolan pressed the gold pen to the paper. He signed his name with a bold, arrogant flourish on the bottom line of the contract. He had just legally transferred the absolute power to destroy his life directly into my hands. The bait was swallowed, the hook was set, and the trap was permanently locked. The very next morning, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted from arrogant celebration to absolute hysteria. I was sitting at my desk in the damp basement, cross-referencing the final set of fraudulent wire transfers, when I heard a loud, piercing scream from the kitchen upstairs. It was not a scream of terror, but a dramatic, theatrical squeal of pure joy. I paused my audit and quietly walked up the wooden stairs to listen from the shadows of the hallway. Sienna was standing in the center of the kitchen, holding a plastic pregnancy test stick in her hand. Nolan was staring at it with his mouth wide open. Beverly was clutching her chest with tears of joy streaming down her face. "We are pregnant," Sienna announced, her voice echoing off the expensive marble countertops. "I am going to have a baby, Nolan." Nolan swept her into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen. He was laughing uncontrollably, completely intoxicated by his own perceived perfection. A new billionaire status, and now a brand new family. He genuinely thought the universe was handing him everything he had ever wanted on a silver platter. Beverly immediately rushed forward and embraced both of them tightly. "Oh my goodness," Beverly cried out. "A baby. A true heir to the tech empire. This is the greatest day of my entire life. We need to start planning a massive baby shower immediately. We need to invite everyone from the country club to celebrate. I will call the caterers right now. We will spare no expense for my new grandchild." I stood completely still, observing the entire pathetic performance. As a trained financial auditor, my brain was hardwired to look for inconsistencies and discrepancies in any given scenario. Sienna had been drinking heavy glasses of red wine the entire week. She had eaten raw sushi just 2 nights ago. Her sudden pregnancy announcement was incredibly convenient right after Nolan secured what they believed was a $50 million buyout contract. She was simply securing her bag, making absolutely sure Nolan would never dare to leave her now that he was about to be ultra-wealthy. It was a calculated trap to lock him down and lock me out forever. Nolan suddenly stopped spinning and looked toward the hallway, spotting me standing there in the shadows. His joyful expression instantly morphed into a look of absolute disgust. He marched over to me, pointing a finger directly at my face. "Did you hear that, Audrey?" he sneered. "We are having a baby. A real family. You need to pack the rest of your garbage and get out of my house today. I am not having my pregnant girlfriend breathe the same air as a miserable barren woman like you." Beverly quickly stepped up beside him, nodding aggressively. "Exactly!" Beverly added, her voice dripping with venom. Beverly pulled out her phone and immediately started drafting a guest list. "I am inviting the mayor and the chief executive officers of all the top firms," she declared loudly. "Everyone needs to see that our family is moving up in the world. And as for you, Audrey, you are not getting a single cent of the family wealth. You have been officially written out of this family history. You are nothing but a temporary mistake that my son is finally correcting. I am throwing the biggest baby shower this city has ever seen next weekend, and I will not have you lurking in the basement like a rat ruining the aesthetic." Sienna smirked, resting her hand on her perfectly flat stomach. She looked at me with triumphant, glowing eyes. "Do not worry," Audrey, Sienna mocked softly. "We will send you a picture of the baby when we are living in our new mansion. Maybe you can frame it in your little rented apartment to remind you of what a real woman looks like." Nolan crossed his arms, looking down at me as if I were an insect. "My lawyers are drafting an eviction notice right now," Nolan threatened. "Once that buyout money hits my account, I am hiring a private security firm to physically remove you and your cheap laptop from my basement. You have 24 hours to pack your bags and walk out the front door before things get ugly." I looked at the three of them standing there, completely blinded by their own lies and greed. They thought this fake pregnancy was the final nail in my coffin. They thought they had finally broken my spirit and forced me to surrender to their cruelty. I did not yell, I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I just offered a slow, chilling smile. "I am not leaving Nolan," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I told you before. I am your legal wife, and I have a legal right to reside in this marital property until a federal judge says otherwise. You can throw your little party. I will stay down in my basement out of your way. But I promise you, I will not miss the celebration." Nolan's face turned bright red with rage, but before he could scream at me again, I turned around and walked back down into the dark basement. I sat back down at my computer screen. The fake pregnancy was a brilliant misstep on Sienna's part. It would only make the impending destruction that much more devastating. Let them buy the expensive balloons. Let them invite the entire wealthy country club. I opened the encrypted folder and prepared the final dossier for the federal agents. The trap was ready to snap shut, and their extravagant baby shower would be the perfect stage for the execution. 2 days after Sienna announced her miraculous pregnancy, the luxury apartment transformed into a chaotic staging ground for her extravagant baby shower. Caterers and event planners were constantly walking back and forth across the hardwood floors upstairs. Down in the damp basement, I remained completely focused on compiling the final financial dossier for the federal regulators. I was linking the last few offshore wire transfers to the forged vendor invoices when the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs swung open. Heavy footsteps pounded down the wooden steps. It was Nolan. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit, looking every bit the arrogant tech billionaire he falsely believed himself to be. He marched over to my small wooden desk and violently slammed a thick stack of legal documents right next to my laptop. "The game is over, Audrey," he announced, his voice cold and dripping with absolute malice. "That is the final divorce settlement. My legal team finished drafting it this morning. Read it, sign it, and get out of my house before the caterers arrive for the baby shower on Saturday. I am not having my guests look at you." I slowly took my hands off the keyboard and picked up the heavy stack of papers. As a certified auditor, my eyes naturally gravitated toward the financial asset division clauses. What I read was not just unfair, it was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty. According to the legally binding document, Nolan was demanding that I absorb exactly 50% of our joint credit card debt. That debt amounted to nearly $80,000. It was money I had borrowed under my own name 3 years ago to pay for his early server hosting fees when his startup was completely broke. Now he was forcing me to pay it back alone. But the cruelty did not stop there. In the equity division section, his lawyers had completely erased my name. Nolan claimed that because the company was undergoing a massive corporate restructuring ahead of the initial public offering, my original founding shares were now legally null and void. He was giving me absolutely 0% of the company I had helped build from the ground up. Finally, at the very bottom of the page, there was a single insulting concession. He was offering me a one-time alimony payment of exactly $10,000. In exchange for this pathetic sum, I had to completely waive my right to ever sue him for future spousal support or corporate equity. I looked up from the papers. Nolan was staring at me with a smug, victorious grin. $10,000 and $40,000 in debt. I said, my tone perfectly flat and devoid of any emotion. You really think a judge will look at this completely one-sided agreement and approve it? Nolan leaned over the desk, planting both his hands firmly on the wood. He lowered his face until he was inches from mine. A judge will approve whatever my expensive legal team puts in front of them, he growled. You do not have the money to fight this, Audrey. If you refuse to sign, I will drag you into a brutal legal war that will last for years. I will freeze your bank accounts and bury you under mountains of legal fees until you are begging for mercy on the street. You will not have a single dime left to fight a billionaire in court. Sienna suddenly appeared at the bottom of the stairs, wrapping a silk robe tightly around her fake pregnant belly. She crossed her arms and let out a vicious little laugh. You should listen to him, Audrey, she chimed in, her voice echoing in the dark room. Take your pathetic $10,000 and run. You can use it to rent a tiny studio apartment in a bad neighborhood. We are building a real legacy here, and we are done pretending you are a part of it. I looked back down at the thick legal contract. Nolan firmly believed he was backing me into a hopeless corner. He thought his financial bullying was going to break me. But his towering ego had completely blinded him to the legal reality of what he was actually demanding. By forcing me to sign this extreme separation agreement right now, he was officially legally severing all my financial ties to his assets and his company. He thought he was robbing me of millions, but in reality, he was handing me a bulletproof shield. When the federal agents stormed his office to arrest him for embezzling $5 million of venture capital funds, the government would immediately seize all of his personal and corporate assets to pay back the investors. Because of this exact contract, I would be completely immune. I would not be liable for his corporate fraud, his incoming federal fines, or his imminent bankruptcy. This cruel contract was not his weapon. It was my ultimate salvation. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a black ink pen. My unnatural calmness caused Nolan to hesitate for a fraction of a second. His brow furrowed in slight confusion. All right, Nolan, I said smoothly, clicking the pen open. If you want a clean break right this second, I will gladly give it to you. Without another word, I flipped to the final page and signed my name on the dotted line with bold, decisive strokes. I signed away the debt, I signed away the fake equity, and I officially detached myself from the sinking ship. I capped the pen and pushed the signed contract across the desk. I will take the debt, Nolan, I said, leaning back in my chair. But keep your $10,000 check. You are going to need it for the prison commissary when you finally realize what you have done. Nolan snatched the documents off the desk, looking slightly unnerved by my complete lack of tears. Just pack your bags, he snapped, turning on his heel. He marched back up the stairs with Sienna trailing behind him. I sat alone in the dim light of the basement, listening to the heavy door slam shut. I looked at the encrypted federal dossier glowing on my laptop screen. He had just signed away his right to drag me down with him. The execution was scheduled for Saturday, and I had the best seat in the house. I followed Nolan and Sienna out of the dark basement and up the wooden stairs. Signing the raw draft in the basement was not enough for Nolan. His towering paranoia and his absolute desperation to secure his $50 million buyout meant the divorce agreement had to be entirely ironclad. He had summoned a private public notary to the apartment to witness the official execution of the documents. He wanted to make absolutely sure that I could never reverse the agreement or stake a claim on his impending billionaire status. The main living room was a chaotic blur of extravagant baby shower preparations. Caterers were carrying massive floral arrangements of white roses and stacking crystal champagne glasses near the balcony. A massive banner with gold lettering that read, "Welcome to the Billionaire Family," was already hanging across the ceiling. Sitting quietly at the center of the marble dining table was a man in a gray suit, with a formal notary stamp resting next to his leather briefcase. Beverly was hovering right behind him, sipping a mimosa and looking absolutely thrilled. "Hurry up and get this over with," Beverly snapped as soon as she saw me walk into the room. "The event planners need this table cleared for the chocolate fountain." "Just sign the official copies, Audrey, so we can finally scrub your name from this family history once and for all." Sienna leaned heavily against Nolan, resting a hand on her dramatically pushed-out stomach. She looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile that disguised her pure venom. "Make sure she takes her little $10,000 check, Nolan," she sneered. "We do not want her starving on the streets before the ink is even dry. It would be terrible for your public image right before the stock launch. We are going to be high society now, and we cannot have your ex-wife begging for scraps outside our new mansion." I walked calmly up to the marble table. The notary pushed 3 identical stacks of thick legal paper toward me. He handed me a heavy silver pen. "Mom," the notary said in a flat, professional tone, "I am required by law to ask if you are signing these documents under your own free will. Do you understand that by signing this agreement, you are completely waiving all rights to the startup company, its current assets, and its future public valuation?" This was the moment they all thought they had completely broken me. Nolan, Beverly, and Sienna watched me with greedy, expectant eyes. They were waiting for me to hesitate. They wanted me to break down in tears or beg for a better financial settlement. They wanted to savor the complete humiliation of a defeated woman losing her entire life. I looked down at the dense legal documents. My hand did not shake even a fraction of an inch. My heart beat with a calm, steady, and terrifying rhythm. They had absolutely no idea what these pieces of paper actually represented. By forcing me to legally sever all joint financial liabilities today, Nolan was blindly building a massive, impenetrable firewall between me and his impending federal crimes. Tomorrow, the Apex Global Ventures acquisition would trigger a mandatory comprehensive financial review. The missing $5 million he used to buy Sienna diamond necklaces and luxury sports cars would be flagged immediately by the automated auditing software. When the Securities and Exchange Commission and the federal authorities finally raided this luxury apartment, Nolan would be standing entirely alone. Because of the exact documents sitting in front of me, the government could not seize my offshore accounts or my trust fund to pay back his stolen venture capital. The crippling debt, the corporate fraud, and the 20-year federal prison sentence would be his alone to bear. I was not signing away my future wealth. I was signing his irreversible death warrant. "Yes, I understand perfectly," I told the notary, my voice smooth as glass. "I am signing of my own free will." I pressed the silver pen to the paper. I signed the first copy with a bold, deliberate stroke. Beverly let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. I signed the second copy. Sienna giggled softly, whispering something congratulatory into Nolan's ear. I signed the third and final copy. The notary collected the thick stacks of paper, checked my identification one last time, and pressed his heavy metal seal onto each page with a loud, satisfying crunch. "It is done," the notary announced quietly, packing his briefcase. "You are legally separated regarding all financial assets and liabilities, effective immediately." Nolan snatched his copies of the agreement, clutching them to his chest like a hard-won championship trophy. He pulled a folded check from his designer jacket pocket and tossed it carelessly onto the marble table. "There is your $10,000, Audrey," he said, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated arrogance. "Now go back down to the basement, pack whatever cheap clothes you have left, and get out of my sight before the important guests arrive." I picked up the check and slipped it into my pocket. I looked at the 3 of them celebrating their hollow, pathetic victory, surrounded by ridiculously expensive baby shower decorations funded by stolen money. "I will be completely out of your way very soon, Nolan," I replied, offering them a perfectly polite smile. "Enjoy your party. Enjoy everything you have built." I turned and walked away, leaving them to their arrogant delusions. I walked back down the stairs to the basement to pack my laptop. The legal chains were finally broken. The corporate trap was fully armed. The countdown to his absolute destruction had officially begun. I packed my encrypted laptop, my few basic clothes, and walked out of that damp basement for the very last time. I did not say goodbye to anyone. I simply walked out the front door, hailed a private black car, and directed the driver to the ultra-luxury penthouse Harrison had quietly secured for me overlooking Central Park. The transition from the suffocating air of my former prison to the quiet, sprawling elegance of my new sanctuary was seamless. From the comfort of a massive leather sofa, I turned on the flat-screen television and watched the inevitable spectacle unfold on the major financial news networks. The initial public offering of Nolan Tech startup officially launched on a bright Tuesday morning. Bolstered entirely by the $50 million cash injection agreement from my ghost entity Apex Global Ventures, the market valuation absolutely exploded. The opening bell rang on the trading floor, and the stock ticker immediately shot upward. The numbers climbed at a dizzying pace. By noon, the financial commentators were practically screaming into their microphones, calling my arrogant ex-husband the undisputed new golden boy of the tech industry. On paper, and only on paper, his net worth officially crossed the $1 billion threshold. The news coverage quickly shifted from the trading floor to a live broadcast outside an exclusive waterfront venue in Manhattan. Beverly had completely hijacked the original baby shower plans and transformed the event into a massive televised billionaire victory gala. The sheer arrogance on display was nauseating, but entirely predictable. Nolan stepped out of a brand-new armored limousine wearing a ridiculously flashy custom tuxedo. He was immediately swarmed by paparazzi and financial reporters shoving microphones into his face. He soaked up the attention like a sponge. He loudly bragged to a reporter on live television that he had just wired the down payment for a brand-new 80-foot luxury yacht to celebrate his monumental success. He proudly announced that he was naming the vessel the Sienna. He spoke about his relentless work ethic and his visionary genius, completely ignoring the fact that he had built his empire on stolen venture capital and my original accounting architecture. Sienna stepped out of the limousine next, soaking in the camera flashes. She was wearing a skin-tight red designer gown that completely contradicted the timeline of her dramatic, fake pregnancy. Hanging heavily around her neck was a staggering 30-carat diamond necklace that sparkled aggressively under the camera lights. She posed for the photographers, deliberately holding up her left hand to flaunt a massive new emerald-cut diamond engagement ring. She looked directly into the cameras and talked about how she stood by her man through all the difficult times. Beverly was right behind them, pushing her way to the front of the crowd. She was actually wearing a small diamond tiara, looking like a delusional monarch parading before her loyal subjects. She gave an interview to a local lifestyle reporter, loudly declaring that her family had finally achieved the elite status they always deserved. She even managed to slip in a passive-aggressive comment about cutting the dead weight out of their lives, a clear and pathetic jab at me. I sat in my quiet penthouse, sipping a glass of chilled, sparkling water and watching them drown in their own bottomless hubris. They were spending astronomical amounts of money they did not actually have. The $50 million from Apex Global Ventures was legally locked in a corporate escrow account, pending the final regulatory audit. The yacht, the diamonds, and the lavish party were all being funded by massive toxic credit lines using the newly inflated public stock as collateral. It was a fragile house of cards built directly on top of a live landmine. They were so blinded by the flashing cameras, the flowing champagne, and the cheering crowds that they completely failed to notice the silent mechanical gears of the federal government turning in the background. The moment the company went public, the Securities and Exchange Commission automated auditing software began processing their public financial disclosures. Every fake vendor invoice, every masked offshore wire transfer, and every single stolen dollar was currently being actively cross-referenced against the aggressive Apex Global Ventures acquisition terms I had drafted. I picked up my phone and sent a single encrypted message to Harrison. The message simply read, "Let the final audits begin." I leaned back against the plush velvet cushions and watched Nolan raise a crystal glass of champagne to the television cameras. He was standing on the absolute peak of the world, grinning like an invincible conqueror, completely unaware that the mountain beneath his feet was scheduled to detonate in less than 48 hours. It had been exactly 3 months since Harrison first walked into my apartment. The deadline to freeze the offshore accounts and execute the corporate takeover had officially arrived. I had spent the last few weeks quietly transitioning my life to the luxury penthouse in Manhattan, but I maintained the illusion of living in the damp basement just to keep my enemies completely blind to my movements. Today was the final day of my charade. I was standing in the dim light of the cellar, packing the last cardboard box of my personal files when the heavy wooden door at the top of the stairs creaked open. The sharp clicking of expensive heels echoed down the wooden steps. Beverly descended into the basement holding her nose in exaggerated disgust. She was wearing a ridiculous sequined cocktail dress way too early in the day. She stopped a few feet away from my old wooden desk and tossed a thick gold-foiled envelope onto the surface. It landed with a soft thud right next to my cardboard box. "I am hosting a massive Thanksgiving gala tonight," Beverly announced, her voice echoing in the cramped space. "We are flying in private chefs from Paris and serving caviar that costs more than your entire college education. It is also the official celebration for my son reaching billionaire status. The entire executive board, the lead investors, and all the most important socialites in the city are attending. I know you only have that pathetic $10,000 settlement to your name, Audrey, so I decided to be generous and offer you an opportunity. If you want to put on a black uniform and come upstairs to work as a catering waitress, I will let you keep whatever tip money the wealthy guests drop on your serving tray. It might help you pay the rent on whatever miserable little apartment you end up in." I looked down at the shiny gold envelope and then back up at her smug face. She genuinely believed she had crushed me into absolute submission. She thought offering me a job as a servant at her son's fake victory party was the ultimate humiliation. "That is an incredibly generous offer, Beverly," I replied, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. "I will definitely be making an appearance upstairs tonight, but I think I will pass on the apron." "Suit yourself," Beverly scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Just make sure you use the servant entrance if you want a plate of leftovers. And make sure you are completely moved out of my house by tomorrow morning. We are turning this miserable basement into a custom wine cellar for Sienna and her new baby." Beverly turned on her heel and marched back up the stairs. The heavy door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the quiet shadows. I looked at my watch. It was 4:00 in the afternoon. The financial markets had just closed. The automated algorithms at the Securities and Exchange Commission had officially finished processing the fraudulent public disclosures Nolan had filed to secure the Apex Global Ventures buyout. The $5 million he stole to buy Sienna her sports cars and diamonds had triggered massive red flags across multiple federal banking systems. Arrest warrants for wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate embezzlement were already being signed by federal judges downtown. A heavily armed team of federal agents was currently assembling in black tactical vehicles just a few miles away. The corporate guillotine was dropping. I reached under my desk and pulled out a sleek black garment bag that Harrison Courier had discreetly delivered earlier that morning. I unzipped the heavy canvas and carefully pulled out the most exquisite piece of clothing I had ever owned. It was a custom Yves Saint Laurent haute couture gown. It was a deep midnight black with sharp, elegant lines that radiated absolute power. The fabric draped perfectly over my shoulders, completely erasing the image of the pathetic basement dweller they thought I was. I paired it with sleek black heels and pulled my hair back into a sharp, elegant style. I did not need heavy makeup or flashy stolen diamonds like Sienna. My absolute control over the situation was the only accessory I needed. It was not a dress meant for a defeated ex-wife begging for scraps. It was a dress crafted specifically for an executioner preparing to swing the blade. I picked up the gold-foiled invitation from the wooden desk. It had Nolan and Sienna names printed in bold, arrogant letters right at the top. They thought tonight was their grand coronation. They thought they had successfully stolen my money, my company, and my dignity. They had absolutely no idea that the silent alarms were already ringing in federal offices. I grabbed my small designer clutch and took one last look around the damp, miserable basement. It had been my temporary command center and my perfect camouflage for the last 3 months. I turned off the single dim overhead bulb, plunging the room into total darkness. I walked up the wooden stairs toward the sound of the loud party music playing in the main living room. The time for hiding was officially over. I pushed the door open and stepped into the blinding light, ready to slaughter their entire empire. I walked up the wooden stairs and stepped out of the basement corridor. The sheer scale of the Thanksgiving gala was entirely overwhelming. Nolan had rented out the massive private ballroom on the top floor of our luxury building to accommodate his inflated ego. The double doors leading into the main event space were slightly ajar, allowing the sounds of a live string quartet and the loud chatter of the ultra-rich to spill out into the hallway. I did not walk in immediately. I waited in the grand foyer. A minute later, the private elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Harrison stepped out. He was wearing a flawlessly tailored midnight blue tuxedo that radiated old money and absolute authority. He looked at my black Yves Saint Laurent gown and offered a slow, approving nod. He extended his arm toward me. I wrapped my hand around his elbow, feeling the solid weight of our alliance. We turned toward the heavy mahogany double doors of the ballroom. Inside, the party was reaching its arrogant climax. I could hear Sienna's voice echoing through the expensive surround sound microphone system. Harrison and I paused just outside the doors to listen. "I just want to thank all of you for being here tonight to celebrate our beautiful family." Sienna projected her voice dripping with fake humility. She was standing on a small, raised acrylic stage at the center of the room. Nolan stood proudly beside her, holding a crystal glass of champagne. "This Thanksgiving, we have so much to be grateful for. Nolan has worked so incredibly hard to build this billion-dollar company from nothing. And as his future wife and the mother of his new heir, I am just so proud to have stood by his side through all the difficult times. We are building a true legacy together." The crowd of venture capitalists, socialites, and media reporters erupted into polite applause. Beverly was standing right in the front row, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. She raised her glass toward the stage, playing the role of the proud aristocratic matriarch perfectly. It was time. I looked at Harrison and gave a slight nod. He pushed the heavy mahogany double doors open with a forceful shove. The doors swung wide, hitting the wall stoppers with a loud, authoritative thud that instantly cut through the applause. The entire ballroom turned to look at the entrance. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The sudden silence in the massive room was deafening. Harrison and I stepped over the threshold and walked into the blinding light of the crystal chandeliers. I kept my head high, my posture perfectly straight, and my expression completely unreadable. The black haute couture gown flowed around me like liquid shadow. I was no longer the pathetic, defeated woman they had banished to the basement. I was the architect of their impending destruction. The crowd of elite guests immediately parted like the Red Sea. They did not move for me, they moved for Harrison. He was a legendary figure in the Manhattan financial district, a ruthless billionaire who swallowed tech startups for breakfast. His presence at a newly minted billionaire party was a massive shock to the press and the investors. The journalists immediately started whispering, pointing their cameras at us. But for Nolan, Beverly, and Sienna, the shock was entirely different. They were not looking at Harrison, they were staring directly at me. Beverly was frozen in the front row, her jaw dropped completely open. The silk handkerchief slipped from her fingers. She stared at my designer gown and the confident grip I had on a world-famous billionaire arm. Her hand began to tremble uncontrollably. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her fingers and crashed onto the marble floor. The sharp sound of shattering glass echoed loudly in the dead silent room. On the stage, Nolan's face drained of all its color. He looked like he had just seen a ghost. His arrogant billionaire posture completely collapsed. His eyes darted from my face to Harrison and then down to my designer dress. His brain was violently short-circuiting, trying to process how the woman he had just forced to sign a $10,000 divorce settlement was walking into his victory gala on the arm of a Wall Street titan. Sienna lowered the microphone, her fake smile completely melting off her face. She instinctively clutched her flat stomach, taking a step back behind Nolan. The cheap triumph she had felt just moments ago was entirely evaporated by my sheer presence. Harrison and I walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the ballroom, stepping right over the spilled champagne and the shattered glass at Beverly's feet. We stopped right in front of the acrylic stage. The cameras flashed aggressively around us. The investors whispered furiously, trying to figure out what was happening. I looked up at Nolan and Sienna. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I simply let the absolute weight of my silence crush them. "Good evening, Nolan," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and carrying clearly through the quiet room. "I hope I am not interrupting this celebration. I received an invitation from your mother to attend. She suggested I might find some work here tonight. But as it turns out, I am just here to finish a project." Nolan opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no words came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sudden shift in power. He thought he was the king of the world tonight. He had no idea that I had just walked into the room to officially behead him. Nolan finally snapped out of his shocked paralysis. The blinding camera flashes around us seemed to trigger his massive ego. He could not stand looking weak in front of his elite investors and the national media. His face turned bright red with fury as he marched to the edge of the acrylic stage, looking down at us. "Security," he yelled, waving his hand frantically toward the back of the room. "I want this woman removed immediately." He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "Audrey, are you completely insane?" he hissed, trying to keep his voice low, but failing miserably. "You sign a divorce settlement for $10,000, and now you sneak into my billionaire celebration to beg for more money. Get out of my building before I have you thrown in a police cruiser." Nolan then turned his misplaced rage toward Harrison. He obviously recognized the legendary billionaire, but his newly inflated arrogance made him completely blind to the danger standing right in front of him. "I do not care who you are," Harrison Nolan spat, crossing his arms defensively. "You might be a big shot on Wall Street, but this is my company and my night. You have no right to bring this pathetic gold digger into my private event. Take her and leave immediately, or I will have my guards physically remove you both." Harrison did not even blink. His expression remained completely carved out of ice. He gently released my arm and adjusted the cuffs of his midnight blue tuxedo. Without saying a single word to Nolan, he calmly walked up the short steps onto the acrylic stage. Sienna let out a small gasp and scrambled backward, dropping her champagne glass. It shattered against the floor, joining the mess Beverly had already made. Nolan puffed out his chest, trying to block the path, but Harrison simply walked right past him like he was a piece of cheap invisible furniture. Harrison reached out and firmly snatched the microphone directly from Nolan's hand. The sharp screech of audio feedback echoed through the massive ballroom, instantly silencing the murmurs of the confused crowd. Harrison tapped the microphone once and looked out at the sea of wealthy investors and hungry journalists. "Good evening, everyone," Harrison began, his deep voice commanding absolute authority. "For those who do not know me, my name is Harrison. I represent the private, offshore wealth management firm that facilitated the recent massive capital injection into this tech startup." The crowd immediately started whispering again. They all knew that the $50 million buyout from Apex Global Ventures was the exact reason this initial public offering was successful today. It was the only thing keeping the stock price skyrocketing. Nolan smirked, crossing his arms again. He genuinely thought Harrison was about to publicly praise his financial genius and validate his new billionaire status. He thought the immediate threat was over, and that Harrison was just here to make a dramatic speech about their lucrative partnership. "I am here tonight to officially confirm that the acquisition is now 100% complete." Harrison continued, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The controlling shares have been fully transferred. The $50 million cash reserve has been placed in an untouchable escrow account pending a federal audit. And effective immediately, a complete corporate restructuring has been executed." Nolan's smile faltered slightly. His eyebrows pulled together in deep confusion. "Corporate restructuring," Nolan whispered loudly, his voice caught by the microphone. "What are you talking about?" "I am the chief executive officer. I own this company." Harrison turned slowly to face Nolan, looking at him with absolute pity. "Not anymore," Harrison stated coldly. "You blindly signed a predatory term sheet that allowed the parent company to seize your entire equity in the event of severe financial discrepancies. And my team found exactly 5 million discrepancies hidden in your fake vendor ledgers. You embezzled investor capital to buy sports cars and diamonds. You do not own a single share of this company anymore, Nolan. You own absolutely nothing." The entire ballroom gasped in unison. It sounded like all of the oxygen had been sucked out of the room at once. The camera flashes erupted like a violent lightning storm. Journalists were shoving each other to get a better angle of the unfolding disaster. The investors began frantically dialing their brokers. Harrison turned his attention back to the shocked crowd and gestured gracefully toward me. I stood tall in my black designer gown, completely unbothered by the absolute chaos breaking out around me. "Ladies and gentlemen of the press," Harrison announced, his voice booming over the noise. "Allow me to introduce the sole beneficiary of Apex Global Ventures. She is the new absolute majority shareholder and the newly appointed chairwoman of the board of directors. Please welcome Ms. Audrey." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a diamond. Nolan stared at me, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick ghost. His brain finally connected all the terrifying pieces of the puzzle: the mysterious $50 million offer, the rushed divorce settlement, the aggressive financial separation he had practically forced me to sign just yesterday. He had literally handed me his entire empire and legally shielded me from his federal crimes on the exact same day. I had used his own bottomless greed to strip him bare. No, Nolan choked out, a pathetic, weak sound escaping his throat. "No, that is impossible. She was in the basement." His legs simply gave out beneath him. The brand new billionaire collapsed directly onto the hard acrylic floor of the stage, landing heavily on his knees. His custom suit crumpled around him as he stared blankly at the floor. Sienna screamed a high-pitched, hysterical sound, realizing her golden ticket had just evaporated into thin air. Beverly slumped against a nearby catering table, clutching her chest as she watched her son's entire world instantly vaporize. I looked down at Nolan, kneeling pathetically before me, while the cameras captured every single second of his absolute ruin. He was a king without a kingdom, a billionaire with a $0 bank account. The game was finally over, and I had won everything. I walked past the shattered glass and ascended the short acrylic steps onto the stage. Nolan was still kneeling on the floor, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I did not look down at him. I did not offer him a single glance of pity or vindication. He had ceased to exist as my husband the moment he handed me that divorce settlement. Now he was nothing more than a rogue employee standing in the way of my company. I reached out and calmly took the microphone from Harrison. The massive ballroom was buzzing with a chaotic mixture of shock and aggressive confusion. I needed to focus their attention immediately. I signaled to the audiovisual technician standing at the back of the room. It was a technician that Harrison had quietly paid off hours before the event began. The giant LED screens behind the stage had been displaying a looping video of Nolan bragging about his visionary tech genius. Instantly, the screens went pitch black. A second later, they illuminated the entire ballroom with the stark white background of a master financial audit report. It was the exact dossier I had meticulously compiled in the damp darkness of the basement. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice echoing with absolute clarity over the premium sound system. "Please direct your attention to the screens behind me. What you are looking at is the true financial architecture of this tech startup. It is the exact architecture that my former husband desperately tried to hide from the Securities and Exchange Commission before today's initial public offering." The first slide displayed the master general ledger, highlighting a massive glaring deficit: $5,200,000. I stated, my tone perfectly clinical and detached. That is the exact amount of Series B venture capital that was illegally drained from the operational budget over the last 14 months. The crowd erupted into a sudden wave of panicked shouts. The lead investors, who had just bought heavily into the public offering, pushed their way toward the front of the stage. Their faces were pale with horror as they stared at the undeniable numbers. I clicked a small presentation remote in my hand, transitioning to the next slide. It showed a side-by-side comparison. On the left were the forged corporate invoices made out to fake third-party logistics firms. On the right were the actual bank routing numbers leading directly to offshore private wealth accounts. The funds were actively laundered using basic vendor masking techniques. I explained, pacing slowly across the stage so the cameras could capture every angle. But the venture capital did not go to logistics or server upgrades. It went to fund a personal billionaire lifestyle that did not actually exist. I clicked the remote one more time. The screen split into dozens of high-resolution images. It showed the corporate wire transfers placed directly next to screenshots of Sienna public social media posts. The $250,000 executive team-building retreat matched perfectly with her photos from a private overwater villa in Bora Bora. The $120,000 emergency hardware upgrade was placed right next to a video of her posing on the hood of a brand new red exotic sports car in Miami. The dates and the massive dollar amounts matched perfectly, down to the very last cent. The journalists in the room went absolutely feral. Camera flashes strobed like violent lightning as they frantically documented the undeniable evidence of federal wire fraud playing out on the giant screens. The wealthy socialites who had just been clapping for Sienna were now staring at her in absolute disgust. Sienna covered her face with her hands, trying to hide behind the catering tables, but the ruthless cameras followed her every single move. Beverly let out a loud wail, realizing the diamond tiara on her head was bought with stolen investor money. Nolan finally found his voice. He scrambled up from his knees and lunged toward me. "Audrey, stop this," he pleaded, his voice cracking with sheer desperation and panic. "You are destroying the public stock price. You are destroying everything we built. We can fix this quietly. Just turn off the screens." I stepped back easily, avoiding his frantic grasp. Harrison stepped cleanly between us, acting as an immovable physical barrier. "There is nothing left to fix, Nolan," I said, staring right through his pathetic tears. "You built a fragile house of cards on top of stolen money, and you handed me the detonator. As the new majority shareholder and the chairwoman of the board of directors, it is my strict fiduciary duty to protect this company from corporate criminals." I raised the microphone back to my lips, ensuring every single person in the room and every camera broadcasting live heard my next words perfectly. "Nolan," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal and absolute chill. "Effective immediately, you are terminated from your position as Chief Operating Officer. You are stripped of all executive privileges, all building access, and all company resources. You are fired." The investors began screaming into their cell phones, frantically ordering their brokers to dump millions of shares of the newly minted stock before the federal regulators officially halted trading. The fake billionaire empire Nolan thought he had built was burning to the ground in real time right in front of his eyes. And I was the one holding the match. The chaos in the ballroom continued to escalate as investors scrambled for the exits. Nolan was still frozen on the stage, completely ruined. That was when Sienna decided to make the biggest mistake of her entirely fabricated life. Instead of running away quietly, she stepped out from behind the catering tables and marched directly toward me. Her face was twisted with absolute rage. She genuinely believed she could still intimidate me by putting on a dramatic show for the remaining cameras. "You are just a pathetic, jealous woman," Sienna screamed, pointing her manicured finger at my face. "You think you can destroy us with a stupid slideshow? Nolan is a genius. He will just build another company, and we will still be richer than you will ever be. My husband is an actual billionaire, and he will crush you and your little ghost company for doing this to me. You are nothing but a bitter ex-wife who could not keep her man." I did not even flinch. I just stared at her with complete emptiness. I did not need to say a single word because her destruction was not my responsibility. It belonged to the man standing right next to me. Harrison let out a slow, dark chuckle. He raised his right hand and simply snapped his fingers. The sharp sound cut through Sienna, hysterical screaming. From the shadows of the ballroom entrance, one of Harrison's elite corporate lawyers stepped forward. He walked briskly down the center aisle carrying a thick manila envelope. He did not look at Nolan or the panicked investors. He walked straight up to the edge of the stage and stopped right in front of Sienna. He held the envelope out toward her. Sienna stopped screaming. She stared at the envelope, her false confidence suddenly wavering. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling slightly. "I am not signing anything from you people. You do not need to sign it, Sienna. The lawyer stated, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet space around the stage. It has already been signed by a federal judge. That is the official execution of the infidelity clause in your prenuptial agreement. Sienna's face turned ash white. The heavy diamond necklace around her throat suddenly looked like a tightly pulled noose. Harrison stepped forward, adjusting his tuxedo jacket. Did you really think my team only investigated Nolan corporate ledgers? Harrison asked, his tone dripping with absolute mockery. We also sent a full copy of this exact financial audit directly to your husband's legal team in London yesterday morning. The Bora Bora Villa receipts and the Miami sports car photos provided undeniable legally binding proof of your long-term extramarital affair. The lawyer opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, reading it aloud for the entire ballroom to hear. Per the strict terms of your prenuptial agreement, any proven infidelity results in the immediate forfeiture of all marital assets. Your husband filed for divorce this morning. As of exactly 4 minutes ago, every single one of your offshore bank accounts, trust funds, and black credit cards has been permanently frozen. You are officially cut off from his entire empire. You get absolutely nothing. Sienna let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest. She reached into her designer clutch and frantically pulled out her phone. She tried to open her mobile banking application, but the screen flashed a bright red error message indicating that her accounts were locked. She started tapping the screen violently, tears streaming down her face and ruining her expensive makeup. It cannot be locked. Sienna sobbed, her voice cracking under the weight of her sudden poverty. He cannot just take everything away from me. I am pregnant. I am having a baby. I finally stepped forward, looking down at her fake flat stomach. Your imaginary baby will not save you, Sienna, I said smoothly. You played a very dangerous game with other people money, and you lost completely. The lawyer took one step closer to her. Furthermore, Sienna, he continued, his voice cold and mechanical. The 30-carat diamond necklace you are currently wearing was purchased using your husband's funds. The red designer gown you have on was paid for using Nolan's stolen corporate credit card. Since both assets are now officially classified as stolen property or frozen marital assets, I am legally obligated to demand that you surrender them immediately. The remaining journalists in the room gasped loudly. The humiliation was absolute and entirely total. Sienna was standing in front of the national media, realizing she did not even own the clothes on her back. You cannot do this to me, Sienna screamed, dropping her phone onto the floor. I will not take off my clothes in front of these cameras. You are all monsters. You can hand over the stolen assets to the federal authorities when they arrive in about 5 minutes, Harrison replied calmly. I suggest you start walking toward the service elevator before the police drag you out of the main lobby in handcuffs. Sienna looked frantically at Nolan, begging him to do something. But Nolan just stared blankly at the floor, completely broken and unable to save himself, let alone her. She was entirely alone. Stripped of her wealth, her fake prestige, and her stolen diamonds, the mistress who thought she was a queen was reduced to nothing more than a sobbing criminal waiting for her prison cell. Sienna was still sobbing uncontrollably, clutching her chest as the reality of her complete financial ruin set in. Nolan remained kneeling on the cold acrylic stage, his eyes glazed over in a state of absolute shock. The ballroom was a swirling vortex of panic. Wealthy investors were sprinting toward the exits, shoving past the catering staff to escape the immediate fallout of the fraudulent public offering. The journalists, however, planted their feet firmly on the marble floor, keeping their camera lenses perfectly focused on the spectacular collapse of a fake billionaire. I stood beside Harrison, watching the chaotic symphony play out exactly as I had orchestrated. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the ballroom did not just open. They were violently thrust apart. A loud, commanding voice echoed over the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. "Nobody move!" the voice shouted. A dozen men and women wearing dark suits and tactical vests, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Securities and Exchange Commission, flooded into the grand foyer. They moved with terrifying precision, forming a solid perimeter around the exit doors and blocking anyone from leaving the crime scene. The lead federal agent, a tall, imposing man with a stern face, marched directly down the center aisle. He bypassed the terrified socialites and the frantic journalists, keeping his sharp gaze locked entirely on the acrylic stage. Two armed officers flanked him, their hands resting carefully on their utility belts. The remaining string quartet musicians scrambled out of their chairs, knocking over their expensive instruments in a desperate attempt to get out of the way. Beverly let out a high-pitched shriek and collapsed against a cocktail table, completely overwhelmed by the sight of federal law enforcement invading her exclusive victory gala. The lead agent stopped at the base of the stage. He pulled a thick, folded document from the inside pocket of his tactical vest. "Nolan," he announced, his voice cutting through the dead silence of the room like a serrated knife. "I am a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are executing an immediate halt on all trading of your corporate stock. I have a federal warrant for your arrest on multiple counts of corporate wire fraud, money laundering, and the direct embezzlement of $5 million in venture capital funds." Nolan slowly lifted his head. His face was entirely devoid of color, looking like a man who had already been pronounced dead. How he whispered, his voice trembling violently. "How did you get the warrant so fast? The audit just happened. Harrison just told you." The federal agent did not even look at Harrison. He looked directly at me and gave a brief professional nod of acknowledgement. "We did not receive this information tonight," the agent replied coldly. A highly detailed and fully encrypted financial dossier was submitted directly to the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission exactly 48 hours ago. The whistleblower provided undeniable forensic accounting evidence that allowed a federal judge to sign this warrant before your public offering even launched this morning. Nolan slowly turned his head to look at me. The final devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place inside his terrified brain. 2 days ago, I had submitted the federal evidence before he had even shoved the cruel divorce settlement into my hands. I had already sealed his fate while he was busy mocking me in the damp basement and forcing me to take on his debt. He had walked right into a burning building and handed me the only fire extinguisher. "You set me up." Nolan choked out, a pathetic sob escaping his throat. "You planned this entire thing. You ruined my life, Audrey." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no remorse. "You ruined your own life, Nolan?" I stated, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I just made sure you paid the correct invoice." The lead agent gestured to the two armed officers standing beside him. They immediately stepped onto the stage, grabbing Nolan by the shoulders and forcefully dragging him up from his knees. Nolan did not fight back. He had absolutely no strength left. The officers twisted his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the microphone system was the loudest sound in the entire ballroom. It was the only jewelry he actually deserved. The cameras flashed furiously, blinding the stage with white light as the officers began marching the disgraced tech executive down the center aisle. Sienna screamed his name, but he did not even look back at her. He kept his head down, staring at the shattered champagne glass on the marble floor. Beverly tried to reach out to him, but an agent firmly pushed her back into the crowd. I stood on the acrylic stage, bathed in the bright lights, holding my head high, as the federal agents dragged my former husband out of the grand ballroom and into the dark reality of his new life. The heavy mahogany doors slammed shut behind the federal agents, taking Nolan away into the cold reality of the criminal justice system. The grand ballroom, which just an hour ago was a glittering monument to his arrogance, was now rapidly emptying. The wealthy venture capitalists, the elite socialites, and the media reporters were scrambling toward the elevators like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Nobody wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a massive federal fraud investigation. The string quartet had already packed their instruments and fled through the service exit. Beverly was left standing alone in the center of the massive room. Her diamond tiara was sitting crookedly on her head, and her expensive silk dress was stained with the champagne she had dropped earlier. The arrogant, aristocratic facade she had worn all evening had completely melted away. She was trembling violently, staring at the empty doorway, where her golden child had just been dragged away in heavy steel handcuffs. She let out a guttural, devastating wail that echoed off the high ceilings. Sienna was still huddled in a corner near the catering tables, sobbing into her hands, but Beverly completely ignored the fake pregnant mistress. Beverly frantically scanned the thinning crowd, looking for any remaining lifeline. Her wild eyes finally locked onto a tall figure standing calmly near the coat check. It was Dion, her son-in-law, and the elite corporate lawyer who had tried to warn Nolan just days ago. He was standing next to his wife holding her coat and preparing to leave the disaster zone. Dion Beverly screamed, her voice cracking with sheer desperation. She hitched up her ruined silk dress and sprinted across the marble floor, slipping slightly on the spilled alcohol. She did not care about her public image anymore. She threw herself at Dion, completely abandoning her pride. Beverly collapsed onto the hard floor, wrapping her arms tightly around Dion's legs. She buried her face in the fabric of his expensive navy suit pants, weeping hysterically. "Dion, you have to help us," Beverly sobbed uncontrollably. "You have to call your law firm right now. Call the federal judges. Call anyone you know in the Justice Department. You have to get my son out of that police cruiser. You are a powerful lawyer, Dion. You can arrange bail. You can fix this. Please do not let them lock my boy in a cage." Dion did not reach down to comfort her. He did not offer a sympathetic shoulder. He simply looked down at his mother-in-law with an expression of absolute ice-cold contempt. His wife stood beside him, wiping a single tear from her cheek, but she made absolutely no move to help her mother up from the floor. She knew exactly what her brother had done, and she was choosing her husband over the sinking ship of her corrupt family. Dion looked across the empty ballroom and made direct eye contact with me standing on the stage. I offered him a slow, subtle nod, acknowledging the brutal reality of the situation. He nodded back before returning his cold gaze to the pathetic woman weeping at his feet. "Let go of my legs," Beverly Dion said, his voice perfectly calm but carrying a heavy, commanding weight. "No, you have to promise me you will defend him," Beverly begged, tightening her grip. "He is your family, Dion. You owe us this. You cannot just abandon him to those federal agents. They are going to ruin his life over a simple accounting mistake." "It is not an accounting mistake," Beverly Dion replied, his tone hardening into pure steel. "It is $5 million of calculated federal wire fraud. I sat in your living room exactly 2 days ago, and I explicitly warned him not to sign that contract. I told him the financial audit would trigger an immediate federal investigation. And do you remember what your brilliant billionaire son told me?" Beverly choked on her tears, unable to answer. "He told me I was a jealous loser." Dion continued, his voice echoing in the quiet ballroom. "He called me a glorified paper pusher who could not stand to see him succeed. He told me to get out of his house. He chose his massive ego over my legal advice. He dug his own grave, and now he gets to lie in it." Beverly looked up at him, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. "Please, Dion," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Dion firmly reached down and pried her hands off his suit pants. He took a deliberate step back, distancing himself from the toxic wreckage of her family. "I worked for 10 grueling years to build my reputation in the corporate law sector," Dion stated, looking down at her with absolute finality. "I am a partner at my firm. I have a clean record and a spotless career. I will not sell out my license to practice law for a stupid federal criminal." Beverly gasped loudly, as if he had just physically struck her. She slumped forward onto the marble floor, completely defeated. Dion turned his back on her. He gently placed the winter coat over his wife's shoulders. He took her hand, and without looking back at the crying matriarch or the ruined billionaire gala, they walked out the heavy mahogany doors. The click of the door shutting behind them sounded like a final heavy lock sliding into place. Beverly was left completely alone on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass, abandoned champagne flutes, and the absolute ashes of her delusional empire. I watched her from my elevated position on the stage, feeling nothing but the cold, satisfying rush of absolute victory. The heavy doors at the back of the ballroom clicked shut, leaving behind a deafening silence. Dion and his wife were gone. The federal agents were gone. The wealthy investors and the ruthless media had entirely evacuated the premises. The grand ballroom, which had been designed as a monument to arrogance and stolen wealth, was now completely deserted. It looked like the aftermath of a violent hurricane. Shattered crystal glass, spilled champagne, and abandoned catering trays littered the expensive marble floor. Beverly was left entirely alone in the center of the wreckage. She was kneeling on the cold floor, trembling violently. The diamond tiara she had worn so proudly was now sitting completely crooked in her messy hair. The aristocratic facade she had maintained for months had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified and broken old woman. She slowly turned her head and looked up at the acrylic stage. Her bloodshot eyes locked onto me. The woman she had spent months torturing, the woman she had banished to a damp basement, the woman she had mocked and humiliated, was now the absolute ruler of the empire she worshipped. I stood tall in my black designer gown, looking down at her from the stage. Harrison stood quietly a few feet behind me, allowing me the space to handle this final piece of garbage entirely on my own. Beverly let out a pathetic whimpering sound. She did not even bother to stand up. She hitched up her ruined silk dress and began to frantically crawl across the floor. She scrambled over the spilled alcohol and the sharp pieces of broken glass, not even caring that her knees were getting cut. She dragged herself to the very edge of the acrylic stage and looked up at me with absolute desperation. "Audrey," she cried out, her voice hoarse and broken. "Audrey, please, you have to listen to me. You have to stop this. You are a good person. You are my daughter-in-law. We are family." I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity. The sheer audacity of her words was genuinely staggering. Just yesterday, she was threatening to have private security throw me out onto the street. She had actively planned this massive gala to celebrate my replacement. She had laughed at my pain and cheered for my destruction. Now she was desperately trying to weaponize the concept of family to save her criminal son. "Family forgives each other, Audrey," Beverly sobbed, reaching her trembling hands up toward my ankles. Nolan was just confused. He was manipulated by that terrible girl, Sienna. He did not mean to do any of this. He still loves you, Audrey. I know he does. You have all the power now. You own the company and you have all the evidence. Please just tell the federal agents it was a massive misunderstanding. Drop the charges. Give him another chance. I promise I will make him treat you like an absolute queen. You can have the master bedroom back. We can be a real family again. Just do not let them lock my boy in a federal prison. I slowly descended the short acrylic steps until I was standing on the marble floor right in front of her. I crouched down so my face was perfectly level with hers. The heavy scent of stale champagne and pure terror radiated from her skin. She reached out, trying to grab the fabric of my dress, but I smoothly stepped back, denying her the comfort of my touch. "Family." I repeated the word, letting it hang like a frozen blade in the quiet room. "You do not know the meaning of that word, Beverly. You only respect money and power. And right now, you have absolutely neither of those things." I leaned in closer until I was inches away from her face. I lowered my voice to a freezing dead calm, ensuring no one else in the massive room could hear her final ultimate humiliation. "You want to talk about forgiveness and second chances?" I whispered, staring directly into her terrified eyes. "Let us start with the absolute basics, Beverly. That ridiculous silk dress you are wearing right now, the one you bought specifically to celebrate my eviction. It was purchased using a corporate credit card tied directly to the venture capital fund that I now completely control. It was paid for by my company." Beverly stopped crying. Her breath hitched in her throat as the horrifying reality of my words began to sink in. "So if you want to negotiate for your son and his future," I continued, my voice devoid of any mercy, "you can start by taking off my dress and returning it to me right now. Take it off, Beverly. Then maybe we will talk about family." I leaned back and stood up to my full height, staring down at her. I watched her brain violently short-circuit. Beverly looked down at her expensive silk dress, and then back up at my cold, unyielding face. The realization that she owned absolutely nothing, not even the clothes on her own back, hit her like a massive physical blow. The last remaining pillar of her aristocratic delusion violently shattered into a million pieces. Her eyes rolled to the back of her head. All the remaining color instantly drained from her cheeks, turning her skin a sickly pale white. She let out a sharp, breathless gasp, and her entire body went completely limp. Beverly collapsed sideways, hitting the cold marble floor with a heavy, dull thud. She had passed out cold, entirely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of her absolute defeat. I stood over her unconscious body for a brief moment, feeling nothing but profound and absolute peace. The toxic empire was officially dead. I turned around and walked back up the steps to Harrison. He offered his arm with a slight, respectful smile. I took it, and we walked together down the center aisle, stepping over the debris of the ruined billionaire gala, leaving the unconscious matriarch lying in the ruins of her own making. The game was finally over, and the board was swept entirely clean. While Audrey and Harrison descended the glass elevator in absolute triumph, the brutal reality of the night was catching up to Sienna in the service corridors of the luxury building. Two massive private security guards had grabbed her by the arms the moment the federal agents cleared the stage. They dragged her away from the catering tables and marched her down the sterile concrete hallway toward the service exit. She kicked and screamed, threatening to have them fired, but her words carried absolutely no weight anymore. Before they reached the final exit, the corporate lawyer had caught up to them. He coldly reminded her of the legal mandate regarding stolen assets. Right there, in a cold concrete room filled with cleaning supplies, Sienna was forced to strip off the 30-carat diamond necklace and the custom red designer gown. The lawyer carefully placed the stolen items into an evidence bag. A female staff member took pity on her and tossed her a cheap, oversized gray wool coat from the employee locker room. Sienna wrapped the scratchy fabric tightly around her shivering body. She was wearing nothing but a thin silk slip underneath. The security guards opened the heavy metal service door and physically shoved her out into the harsh November night. She stumbled forward, her expensive high heels scraping violently against the dirty pavement of the back alley. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind her, and the deadbolt clicked loudly. She spun around and pounded her fists against the cold steel, screaming for them to let her back inside. No one answered. The billionaire sanctuary was officially permanently locked. A freezing wind whipped through the concrete canyon of Manhattan, cutting right through the cheap gray coat. Sienna shivered violently. She reached into her designer clutch, the only item she was allowed to keep, because she had bought it before meeting Nolan. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably as she pulled out her expensive smartphone. She opened her premium ride-sharing application, attempting to call a luxury black car to take her to a 5-star hotel. She typed in the destination and hit request. A bright red error message instantly popped up on the screen. Payment method declined. Panic seized her throat. She quickly opened her mobile banking application, praying that at least one of her personal credit cards had survived the legal massacre. She scrolled through her accounts. Every single one of them displayed a terrifying zero balance, with a bold notification that the assets were frozen by federal mandate. She had no checking account. She had no savings. Her platinum credit cards were entirely useless pieces of plastic. She did not even have $20 in cash to hail a regular yellow taxi. Sienna stumbled out of the dark alley and onto the brightly lit main avenue. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal law enforcement convoy illuminated the entire city block. She stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching the heavily armored tactical vehicles pull away from the grand entrance of the luxury building. Through the tinted window of the second police cruiser, she saw him. Nolan was sitting in the back seat, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back. His head was bowed in absolute defeat. He did not look out the window. He did not look for her. The man who was supposed to buy her a mansion and a private yacht was now on his way to a federal holding cell. She watched the taillights of the police convoy disappear down the avenue, taking her imaginary billionaire lifestyle with them. Sienna looked down at her glowing phone screen. Her social media notifications were exploding. The live broadcast of the ballroom disaster had already gone viral across every major platform. Millions of people had watched her get stripped of her fake wealth and humiliated in front of the entire country. She opened her profile. The comments under her glamorous photos from Bora Bora and Miami were absolutely brutal. Her followers were tearing her apart, calling her a fraud, a criminal, and a pathetic gold digger. The luxury brands that had sponsored her just hours ago were already releasing public statements, cutting all ties and distancing themselves from the massive financial scandal. Her digital empire was burning down just as fast as her physical reality. Sienna dropped the phone. It clattered against the cold concrete sidewalk. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, feeling the bitter irony of her fake pregnancy. She had orchestrated that massive lie to secure her position at the absolute top of the social hierarchy. Now she was standing alone on a freezing street corner in New York City, wearing a borrowed employee coat. She had no home, no money, no powerful boyfriend, and absolutely no future. In less than 20 minutes, she had plummeted from a high society influencer to a penniless vagrant standing under the harsh glare of a flickering street lamp. The cold wind howled around her, delivering the ultimate bitter punishment for her bottomless vanity. Exactly 1 month had passed since the flashing red and blue lights of the federal police convoy faded into the cold Manhattan night. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my luxury penthouse. The crisp December wind whipped across the terrace, but I did not feel the cold. I looked down at the glittering skyline of the city. It was a city that used to terrify me when I was trapped in that damp, miserable basement. Now it was a city that I held firmly in the palm of my hand. The aftermath of the Thanksgiving gala had been swift and absolutely merciless. Nolan was currently sitting in a federal holding facility awaiting a massive criminal trial. The federal prosecutors had used my pristine financial dossier to deny his bail completely. He was facing 20 years in federal prison for corporate fraud and massive embezzlement. Beverly had been forced to sell her remaining jewelry just to afford a tiny studio apartment in a terrible neighborhood far outside the city. She was completely cut off from the high society she loved so much, and Sienna had simply vanished into thin air. Without her stolen designer clothes and her fake billionaire boyfriend, her digital empire had completely collapsed. She was just another forgotten ghost in the city. The tech startup, however, had experienced a massive and incredible rebirth. Once the federal agents cleared the building and arrested the corrupt management team, I immediately stepped into my role as the new chairwoman. I purged every single executive who had helped Nolan hide the stolen venture capital. I brought in a team of elite forensic accountants to completely restructure the corporate ledgers. The financial markets had initially panicked, but my absolute transparency and my aggressive restructuring plan quickly won back the trust of the major institutional investors. The public stock stabilized, and then it began to climb higher than Nolan could have ever imagined. The company was now generating massive legitimate profits, and I owned the absolute majority of it. I heard the soft slide of the heavy glass balcony door opening behind me. I turned around and saw Harrison stepping out into the cold night air. He was wearing a sharp-tailored charcoal suit. In his hands he held a chilled bottle of vintage champagne and 2 expensive crystal flutes. He walked over to the edge of the glass railing and stood beside me, looking out over the glowing city. He popped the cork with a soft, satisfying thud and poured the golden liquid into the crystal glasses. He handed one to me. He did not offer a grand speech or a dramatic declaration. Our partnership was built on mutual respect, absolute efficiency, and cold, hard numbers. We had executed the perfect corporate takeover, and we were both reaping the massive financial rewards. To a perfectly balanced ledger, Harrison said, raising his glass toward the skyline. To a perfectly balanced ledger, I replied, clinking my crystal glass against his. I took a slow sip of the expensive champagne. The cold, sparkling liquid tasted like absolute freedom. I thought about the heavy wooden desk in the basement, where I used to sit for hours shivering in the damp air, while my husband paraded his mistress upstairs. That desk was gone now. My new office was a massive corner suite on the top floor of a glass skyscraper. I had a team of 50 brilliant financial analysts reporting directly to me every single morning. I was no longer the obedient wife carrying the financial burdens of an arrogant man. I was completely independent. I was autonomously wealthy. I had built a massive steel fortress around my life, and absolutely no one would ever be able to tear it down again. The financial press was calling me a corporate savior. They wrote endless articles about the brilliant woman who orchestrated the most aggressive and legally flawless hostile takeover in the history of Wall Street. They praised my cold calculation and my absolute lack of mercy. But they did not know the personal hell that had forged that coldness. They did not know about the fake pregnancy or the cruel divorce settlement. They just saw the victorious billionaire standing at the finish line. Harrison offered a rare, genuine smile and stepped back inside the warm penthouse, leaving me alone on the balcony to enjoy my victory. I rested my hands on the cold glass railing and looked down at the bustling streets far below. Millions of people were rushing through their lives completely unaware of the quiet, brutal war that had just been fought and won in the boardrooms above them. I took one final look at the empire I had conquered. My mind flashed back to the unpaid bills, the cruel insults, and the massive corporate fraud that started this entire journey. Nolan thought I was just a weak, pathetic numbers girl. He thought he could steal from his investors, cheat on his wife, and just walk away completely untouched. He made a fatal miscalculation. He forgot the most important rule of the financial world. Never betray an auditor, because they always know exactly how to calculate your total ruin. The most profound takeaway from this narrative is the absolute triumph of strategic patience and emotional discipline over impulsive anger. When faced with ultimate betrayal and cruelty, it is human nature to lash out, scream, or demand immediate justice. However, the protagonist demonstrates that true power lies in calculated silence. Instead of confronting her arrogant husband and his mistress with tearful accusations, she channeled her pain into her greatest weapon, her professional expertise. She observed her enemies closely, understanding that their towering egos and bottomless greed were their fatal vulnerabilities. By allowing them to believe they had completely defeated her, she effectively blinded them to the legal and financial traps she was meticulously building. Every insult she endured in that damp basement was a calculated investment toward her ultimate undeniable victory. Furthermore, the story highlights the severe danger of underestimating others based on superficial metrics. The antagonists dismissed the protagonist as a weak, powerless accountant. They failed to realize that the person who truly understands the complex numbers ultimately controls the entire game. Arrogance creates massive blind spots. Those who build their empires on deceit, stolen wealth, and the humiliation of others will eventually face the crushing consequences of their own fragile foundations. True independence is not just about acquiring wealth, it is about possessing the sharp intelligence and the iron will to protect yourself against those who attempt to exploit you. Ultimately, the narrative teaches us that standing up for yourself does not require screaming or chaos. The most devastating response to betrayal is simply outsmarting your opponents, legally securing your own success, and letting their own greed engineer their absolute downfall.